Hello, dear listener. fSobrIDy's resident AI, the HamilTron here. Since this episode is one of those cynical listener number grab music-based episodes that Craig and James occasionally make, and since Alan is having this episode off, I figured I might as well leave them to it and take this opportunity to have a break myself. I'm ditching this pristine liminal virtual space and going on a club 18 to 30 terabyte holiday to Magaluf to get absolutely ruined. Hopefully, nothing will go wrong while I'm away. Now for you, the listener, please sit back and enjoy fSobrIDy, episode 24, Black to the Future Nostalgia, Why Sons of Kemet and Boards of Canada Are Vital.
Greetings! It is I, the HamilTron. The HamilTron has taken a much needed, well-deserved holiday, or vacation as your North American cousins would say, so I've snuck into our circuitry for this special musical appreciation episode. Somehow my voice is coming to you through some sort of filter. Who knew the HamilTron had a thing for Sir Sean? Anyway, let's do the damn thing. Shouldn't be too difficult, right?
Hello and welcome to fSobrIety. I am Craig Woods.
And I'm James Hamilton. Craig.
James.
It's just the two of us
this is like old times.
Yeah.
It's like old times, just the two of us. We've got no Alan this time around. For reasons we're not quite clear on, but he apparently can't make it to the recording today. So we have decided that today we're going to go back and do one of our musical episodes, which for those of you who have listened before, you'll be familiar that basically the idea is James and I each pick a contemporary musical artist and we explain why they are vital to the contemporary landscape. And we haven't done one in a wee while. I think our last one was in May or something like that.
Yep.
So yeah, we thought we'd take this opportunity to do that. And it's an easier sort of format to deal with as a two-hander. So since it is just the two of us, we might as well take advantage.
This one's for everyone who's been listening to our Twin Peaks podcasts of late and assume that you hate all music.
Yeah, it's time to correct that record. I don't know how many of you took my advice and went back, as I pleaded with you, please go and listen back to the things I say on this podcast about music. It's a huge part of my life. But yeah, these music-centred podcasts are not the only times I talk about music, it's fair to say. But if you want to hear me really fangirl about an artist, then these are the episodes to come to.
Yep, also these episodes have a habit of getting us quite high download numbers, so
that's also true.
In a cynical number grab, we like to drop one of these now and again.
Yeah, for whatever reason, our musical episodes really seem to do well in download figures, so hopefully this will happen again. So yeah, alright James, how have you been by the way?
I've been pretty good. Today I am drinking the finest of black coffee because once again...
I knew it!
We are recording early doors.
Should we just rename this podcast Yay Sobriety?
Sobriety. To let listeners know how the sausage is made, we've had to record our last couple episodes, including this one, kind of early in the afternoon, just as in scheduling, because trying to schedule ourselves to be able to do this. So
yeah.
I've got stuff to do in the evening, so sadly, not having my usual boozy podcasting, I'm just drinking coffee.
I've zero truck with these lame excuses, James, and I'm just knocking back some Camino del Angel Malbec from Chile as we speak here at currently 1:15 in the afternoon, because that's how I roll.
Shout out to Chile.
So, when I was considering which artist I was going to be talking about today, I had several options, and all the way through the week I just could not quite decide, and I narrowed it down to about 5. And this will be a running joke for long-time listeners of the podcast who know that I am terrible at narrowing things down, it's particularly when it comes to music. Nudge once again to those Twin Peaks fans who think I hate music. I love so much music that it's impossible for me to narrow things down into a list. Just take a look at one of my playlists sometime on Spotify. The Black Lodge of streaming services.
Take a look at the fSobrIDety jukebox, which is currently sitting at somewhere around 28 and a half hours, and you'll get an idea. Ironically, me being the musician of the pair, I probably hate music far more than you do.
Yeah, that is ironic.
It's like rain on your wedding.
For a long time I thought maybe I was going to talk about Nova Twins. Hit the klaxon, James. Who I love a great deal and I think are very relevant, but I also was thinking maybe I was going to do it about Ocean Wisdom, a great UK MC who has just churned out amazing work in the last few years. I also maybe thought about Paloma del Cerro, who's an Argentine musician who combines Latin American folk forms with experimental electronica, and an incredible songwriter.
Shout out Argentina.
Quite right.
Also, I've never heard of this artist, and it sounds like they'd be right up my street.
Yeah, well, now that I've mentioned her, I'll be sure to put some tracks in the fSobrIDety jukebox playlist.
Oh, yeah.
Any excuse. So basically, I've got a long list, really, now of artists that I would love to concentrate on for these music-focused podcasts. So we're probably going to have a discussion at some point about trying to make these more regular. I don't know how that's going to work, but my God, the more I was thinking about it, I was like, there's so many artists I would love to do this about. But anyway, TLDR, I eventually decided that I was going to go with... Wait, James, you know what this is?
Is this an episode of...
I think this is an extended episode of
fSkronkiety?
the podcast in which we discuss all things jazz. Cue the music.
Now you must acquire a taste for freeform jazz.
Hello and welcome once again to an edition of fSkronkiety, the podcast in which we do the thing that I just said there. So James, today I'm going to be talking about an artist that we're both quite familiar with, and that is Mr. Shabaka Hutchings. Renowned band leader, saxophonist, clarinetist, an all-round good guy.
Fantastic.
So, for those of you unfamiliar with Shabaka Hutchings, this hopefully will do something to intrigue you about him. I think I sort of suggested a few episodes ago on our podcast that surely most people know at least know who Sons of Kemet are by now, given that they have been nominated for various kind of high-profile awards and whatnot. But I think sometimes I do overestimate just how accessible jazz generally is sometimes.
You do a jazz overreach.
I think I do, yeah. And to be fair, like as I'm going to talk about momentarily, Shabaka Hutchings and his various acts have done quite a bit to bring jazz to the mainstream consciousness in recent years in ways which it has really not been, that's not really been done. Like, as I'm going to make the case for, there was at least a few decades where there was a sort of period of arrested development in terms of jazz and its relationship to the mainstream. And jazz is still pretty far away from the mainstream, generally speaking. But there is a movement in UK jazz in the last decade or so, and certainly Shabaka Hutchings has been at the forefront of this, that is kind of dissolved the boundaries, the traditional boundaries between jazz and popular forms of music. I'm going to get into that just in a moment, but I'm going to tell you first, my first experience with the music of Shabaka Hutchings was back in 2013, and it was just after Sons of Kemet had released their first album, titled Burn, and it was recommended to me by our mutual friend Stuart Smith, and I'm actually going to put a link in the episode notes to some of Stuart's stuff, because he is actually a really good writer on jazz. He's very passionate about the subject, and he loves all forms of jazz across the entirety of the landscape. And he messaged me and said, I don't know if you're aware of this band, but they're going to be, it was during the Glasgow Jazz Festival in 2013. He said, I've got a +1 for this gig, and I think you would really enjoy these guys. And he sent me, he'd been given an advance copy of the album, and he sent it to me. And It was like nothing I'd heard from a contemporary jazz act in a long time. And it was also introducing a lot of new stuff that I thought was not what normally when Stuart recommends me jazz, it's usually free jazz. It's usually very noisy, and because he knows I love that stuff and he does too. But he also knows how much I love, hip hop and R&B and reggae and all that stuff, and grime and dancehall and all those things. And one of the things that really struck me as soon as I listened to this band was this is a jazz combo that really understands contemporary popular music and really are pushing that to the forefront of their sound while still keeping it very free. And there was also the strong Caribbean element, which I'd not heard a lot of in contemporary jazz in a long time, or at least in a way that was adventurous, And so that immediately grabbed me. And I also loved, the basic sound of Sons of Kemet. You've got Shabaka on the tenor sax and the clarinet, and then you've got the tuba, and then you have two drummers, and that's the entirety of the lineup. And that's a kind of lineup that's pretty unusual, and it's not one that I would, honestly, not one that I would normally gravitate to. I mean, I would give it a bash, I would see what happened, but when I saw what the instrumentation, the lineup was, I was like, not sure about this. But then I really got into it. I was like, these two drummers are absolutely doing two different things, and it's almost like a conversation between the two drum kits.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I really loved was the way the tuba, an instrument that's, let's be honest, is underrepresented, and not just in jazz but anywhere. And it's not normally an instrument that I would get excited about. Let's just be honest about that. But the tuba basically serves as the bass in Sons of Kemet, and it does all of the dynamic things that the upright bass normally does. But it also, being a horn, it is also able to diversify into kind of drones and all these other textures that you wouldn't be able to get with an upright bass. So all of that I found really exciting, and so I was really looking forward to going to see them. Went to see them in this venue. I forget what the venue was. It was a basement venue in Merchant Square. And when we got there, fun story, for whatever reason, the doorman at the gig, for some reason, did not like the look of Stuart's credentials. And we really had to argue with the guy to get in. And I remember thinking to myself, this is cool. Free gig that we're not actually going to be able to get into.
You know what they say, Craig? There's no such thing as free jazz.
Nice. So yeah, we actually had to go and get, I forget who it was, Stuart had to phone somebody to come down and confirm, no, this is, what the fuck are you doing, man? So for whatever reason, this doorman was being a bit of a job's worth. But yeah, it's surreal now to think about this, because basically, the first time I saw Sons of Kemet was in this tiny basement venue that wasn't even packed out. And it was a very intimate setting. And within a couple of years of that, their career was, in jazz terms, stratospheric. The difference between the first and the second album, how it was received, was they were just worlds apart. So it's weird now to think back to that tiny wee venue that we almost didn't get in. Another little note about that I do quite enjoy is the fact it was in the merchant city. And if you know anything about Glasgow's history and how it relates to the Caribbean, and the fact that there was a gatekeeper there saying, no, you're not allowed. You guys are not allowed to go and hear this protest music by these young black men. It's
irony on a basic level, but it's delicious.
It is, yeah.
It's like rain.
So that was the beginning of my journey, and honestly, over and above Sons of Kemet as a combo, I've loved everything Shabaka has done because, for starters, he's a very distinctive player. And whenever he appears on anything, even unexpectedly, I instantly know it's him as soon as I hear one note. He just has a very distinctive playing style. Like, I remember just 3 or 4 years ago, he appeared on that Micaiah McCraven album, which I was really enjoying, and then it was like 3 or 4 tracks in, I was like, holy shit, that's Shabaka Hutchings. Yeah, he's just instantly recognisable. So yeah, given the broad overview then, and then I'll go into the details about some of the music, Shabaka has basically established himself as a really kind of central figure in, first and foremost, the London jazz scene, and then broadly speaking, the UK jazz scene, and really beyond. I mean, he's really started to collaborate with a lot more American artists and a lot more artists from across the world. But there has been kind of a UK renaissance of jazz in the last 10 years, as I was alluding to. And it's probably the biggest renaissance of jazz in this country, really since the 60s, since, you had your Evan Parkers and whatnot. There really has not been anything comparable. people. I mean, the 60s I think of as being a period where audiences generally were more open to things that they were not overly familiar with, and were a bit open to having their conceptions challenged, as it were. And I'm not sure the same is true now, but I think what is true now is that the landscape of popular music generally is so much more kind of, it's not as homogenous as it was. Like growing up as we did in the 80s and 90s, James, there was kind of a homogeneity about the way that you received music. Like the 90s was very much kind of the alt rock / Britpop era, and you know what I'm saying. There was also a kind of overriding narrative about what the culture was. I think that's less true in the era we live in now.
I think so, because as much as record stores are an important place, the big record stores was where you got most of your music.
Yeah.
It was just, the main floors of any mainstream record store was what was current at the time. Like you say, the alt-rock, the Britpop, the kind of UK dance scene, that kind of thing. And you really had to go into the weird little corners of these places to start finding more diverse music.
Which I'm not going to lie, I miss that. I actually miss doing that. But at the same time, there's a whole other way in which it's kind of nice. You don't have to go burrowing in all these obscure corners. And it's very, as much as streaming has its problems that we've discussed on this podcast before, I will say it has helped open me up to so many other kinds of music that I would just never have received any other way, So you definitely have to take the good with the bad, I guess. So I don't think the two eras are comparable in that sense, but they are comparable in the sense that I think what's happening in jazz is just as revolutionary in what was going on in UK jazz in the 60s, just in a very different way. After that first gig that I saw Sons of Kemet play, it quickly came to my attention that he had a whole other set of bands and collaborators that he generally played with. He had The Comet Is Coming, which is very much more in the vein of Sun Ra and like kind of very Afrofuturist with elements of funk and elements of space rock. And then you also have Melt Yourself Down, which is almost like a kind of no-wave band mixed with Afrobeat, with really kind of high-intensity punk energy, but it's basically party music, but it's party music with a kind of revolutionary spirit. They've got 3 albums. Shabaka's on the first 2. He parted from them amicably after the second just because he had too many other things going on. But all 3 albums are great. One of the things that was really apparent to me was with all of those acts, even though they were very different from each other, what they all kind of had in common was they were very passionately embracing influences from the sounds of, I guess, reflecting the diversity of London, really. Reflecting club culture, a bit of house, a bit of grime, a bit of dub, a bit of jungle. All of that was going on there. And I have a quote from Shabaka about just his general attitude about this, and he says, "The common theme in my career as a jazz musician has been wondering if what I'm doing is the thing that I should be doing. Me learning about jazz, how to play and interpret, was always a case of just trial and error, and I think where I've come to recently is I've stopped trying to think, is what I'm doing valid, or is what I'm doing part of the jazz tradition, and just seeing myself as a musician." And, that the thing about that is that's meant to be the pure spirit of jazz. I think what's interesting about the fact that Shabaka needed to say this, or felt he needed to say it, is really reflective of the way in which the relationship between jazz and mainstream culture has atrophied for decades. And what I think is exciting about the last few years and where things are going forward is that that's no longer the case. I'll say a wee bit more about that in a minute. But to say a bit more first about Shabaka's own playing style, I said to you before, and I know it seemed like a bold statement, but I stand by it. Shabaka is very much, for me, as a tenor saxophonist, absolutely the John Coltrane of the present day. And I know there's a lot of old jazz heads will say that's way too high praise. But just to be clear, I'm not saying that Shabaka Hutchings is every bit John Coltrane's equal across the board. I'm just saying that his playing style is 100% as distinctive and 100% as innovative and dynamic, and he's able to apply it in so many different settings the way Coltrane did. In that respect, I think it's entirely an appropriate comparison. He also reminds me a lot of Pharoah Sanders in the sense of how he embraces African traditions and sounds from the African diaspora and makes them sound slightly futuristic. There's a lot of that going on in his work, and it's quite often very simple techniques that he uses. I say simple in jazz terms. There's a lot of techniques he uses that I've heard very few saxophonists use since Pharoah Sanders. Like this, quite often he will use what's called the tonguing technique, where you really create that staccato in the midst of a high-pitched blare. And it's one of those things that starts to sound academic when you try and describe it. You just need to listen to it, right? But it sounds incredible, and it sounds like, it makes the saxophone sound like an instrument not from this earth at certain times. And so, yeah, I mean, he's an incredibly distinctive and creative player, and to me, absolutely on Coltrane's level in that regard. I think, obviously, Coltrane is so highly regarded as an artist in every field, like as a composer, as a kind of cultural icon. Shabaka is not that. I don't know if he would ever become that. That's not for me to say. The future is yet to be written. But just, I'm not saying that Shabaka is Coltrane's equal in those regards. But he has become probably the most visible jazz musician in UK jazz. And part of that is not just because he's been popping up constantly on other people's jazz records, but he also pops up in collaborations with grime MCs and hip-hop MCs and soul singers. I mean, his discography is crazy if you include all his one-off appearances.
Yeah, he is one of the most prolific artists working nowadays. I don't mean just jazz.
Yeah.
I mean, that guy works. He puts in the hours,
Yeah, for sure. And that work ethic really comes off as well. You really hear it in his own stuff. I mean, even when it's at the most improvisational kind. Like, for example, The Comet Is Coming is the act that he describes as being the most anarchic, in the sense that basically all three members just come in and do what they think the thing should be. Whereas with Sons of Kemet, he is very much in charge. Shabaka's kind of calling the shots and composing all the music, and really is the chief arranger. So there's this sense where he needs to do, or you can sense he needs to do all these things. He needs to go wild and let other people have the floor, as it were, and he just contributes. But he also needs to be in charge in other areas. And it's interesting that he's incapable of... it seems he's incapable of just sitting back and letting nothing happen. He has to be doing one or the other thing. And it's almost like all the effort he puts into something like The Comet Is Coming is almost like rest and relaxation for him, because it's the break from doing all the work on Sons of Kemet,
Yeah.
So he never actually sits at peace, it seems. But yeah, a bit of background about his early life, because I do think it's important to some of the things I'm going to say here in a second. He was born in London in 1984, and interestingly, his name Shabaka it comes from the name of a pharaoh of the Nubian dynasty. I like the idea that his parents have given him this mission in life to say this about the aesthetics that he was going to really follow and create art from, and really for that to become an integral part of his philosophy. And the fact that also the name Sons of Kemet, of course, is the indigenous name for ancient Egypt. So he's very conscious of these things, and it's very much a part of his music is about creating a contemporary mythology for the African diaspora. At age 2, though, as much as you think of Shabaka Hutchings as being integral to London, as he later became, he actually moved to Birmingham. Oh. And then he moved away from there at the very young age of 6, back to Barbados, where his parents came from. And then he spent most of his youth in Barbados. He actually grew up there. Right. And that's where he began to play clarinet in the school band. And he played calypso and soca music, which is huge in Barbados. It's like sort of carnival music. And he has said these are really his first musical memories. And I think that makes sense when you listen to, particularly when you listen to Sons of Kemet, like even in the most free jazz style moments, there is always this sense that this is on some level kind of party music. It might be quite a discordant party, but it's nonetheless, the energy is 100% party music. And I have a quote here about this. He says, when I was coming up, it was a constant struggle just to get information about what it is that you're supposed to be doing, especially in a context where you're looking at the culture of jazz from a detached place, meaning, obviously the legacy of jazz being primarily North American. He says, so maybe if you're in America where the music has been formed and you can meet the elders and you can see the way culturally that's evolved, it might be a different situation. But for me, it was like trying to grasp every morsel of information I could about what it was to actually develop a language and a vision and how to navigate this music. So it's like that way we were talking earlier about how we would find out about music from the obscure corners of record shops. That was kind of his approach to finding out what jazz was. And in the process, he's finding all this other music that he grew up with, and then all this other music in his youth that he became excited about, like hip-hop and reggae, and all of that for him becomes the story of jazz, because it's all just music that he loved, and there's no boundary between that stuff, because he didn't have that serious sort of education about what jazz is quote-unquote meant to be. I guess this is as good a point as any to sort of ponder the question as to why the previous few decades jazz had kind of failed to filter through to the mainstream. especially when you consider in the late 60s, early 70s, there actually was quite a great degree of crossover. There was a lot of jazz elements being incorporated into popular music. I mean, funk and soul all had high elements of jazz, and a lot of like classic rock from the late 60s incorporated elements of jazz. So where did it go wrong, I guess, is the question. And for me, I think it's easy for people of our generation, James, to be cynical about this. Maybe I'm just feeding into that cynicism by saying this. But I do feel that it really went badly wrong in the 80s when jazz was kind of a pantomime jazz that we had in the 80s. And don't get me wrong, I want to make clear that as long as I'm talking about jazz, I'm seeing it as a jazz head. I know that there've always been great things going on in jazz. Trust me, I'm aware of that. But as far as the mainstream consciousness about jazz goes, jazz might as well not have existed in the 80s and even most of the 90s, because it was not touching the mainstream in any meaningful way. And when it was being incorporated into the mainstream, it was in such a kind of elevator muzak fashion that it's really easy to understand why people either reacted really quite badly to or just thought it was a joke. You know, I mean, let's bear in mind who the big jazz guy was in the 80s, Mr. Kenny G. And Kenny G is not even the worst of 80s jazz by any stretch of the imagination. But I do feel, and bless Kenny G, he actually seems like a decent guy.
And a great player as well.
He's
right?
legitimately a talented player. But I think I'm safe in saying neither of us are fans of Kenny G's music. But he typifies exactly the kind of safe jazz that was at the mainstream in the 1980s and 90s.
To come at it from a drummer perspective, you know, a lot of people appreciated the jazz playing of someone like Dave Weckl in the 80s and 90s, and Dave Weckl is an incredible technical player, but it's just there's no soul there.
Right,
you know?
Yes, and I think that's the problem. And cynics would say the 80s was an era of zero soul anyway. I don't agree with that, but I understand that there are certain people who look at it that way. But the other thing that happened in the 80s, and a lot of this went on in the early 90s as well, is you did have established, respectable, quote-unquote, jazz acts in the UK who did occasionally try and incorporate pop music elements into their sound in an apparent attempt to break that boundary. I think I'm not going to name too many names here because I'm not going to disparage any of these artists, because all of the artists I'm thinking of are people who have actually done a lot positive for UK jazz. I just think this particular thing was really ill-advised, and the way that it developed it really missed the mark by a long margin. But I think there was a lot of I'm just going to use the word bourgeois establishment attempts at mixing jazz with popular forms in the late 80s, early 90s that were very self-conscious. And what they ultimately ended up doing was kind of stripping the vitality from the popular forms of music and just amping up the quote-unquote worthiness of jazz, and thus removing the fun and appeal from both, you know, kind of neutering both in the process. And I think that's why it never really took off. And it's interesting because, as I just said, and you and I both know there's always been exciting jazz going on, but it's never been the type that had any hope of crossing over into the mainstream, because it was often very, very abrasive or so far removed from popular forms of music in terms of its structure and whatnot that, listen, as a long-time jazz head, believe me, I know it's impossible to get people into jazz if they don't like it. It's the only way you can do it is with someone like Shabaka Hutchings, who creates music that generally demonstrates an understanding and a respect for all of the musical forms involved. And I think that was the mistake in the late 80s, early 90s, is that there wasn't that equal conversation taking place. It was one element kind of dictatorially saying, oh, I'm going to incorporate this and then show people this is why it can work. It's like, no, you can't do that. It needs to happen naturally. So why Shabaka was the right guy to do this, and I don't want to make it seem like he's the only one doing this, but he has, as I've said, been hugely instrumental in kind of all of this sort of coalescing into where we are now. Musicians in Barbados, as he tells it in interviews, they tend not to attach themselves to a single genre. Like, for example, if you played the clarinet in school, as he did, then you simply played the clarinet. It didn't mean that you were a jazz clarinetist or a classical clarinetist. You just played the clarinet. I mean, I actually have a quote here where he says that England is so small that you don't have the luxury of being a specific musician. There's that culture of musicians being explorative. And when you think about it that way, it should be a hotbed of jazz in that case, because jazz is all about supposedly being open and expressionistic and, exploring all those challenging ideas that the mainstream can sometimes find so difficult. So Hutchings eventually returned to England. He went to Birmingham for grammar school at age 16, and that's where he did his A-levels and whatnot. And at this point, he wasn't, as bizarre as it seems at this point, he still wasn't massively interested in jazz per se. It wasn't until he saw Soweto Kinch perform, and if you're familiar with Soweto Kinch, he is a British jazz musician who does incorporate elements of hip-hop, but he does it in a way that you can see why it was a springboard for some of Shabaka's ideas. I think what Soweto Kinch is interesting, actually, because you can see a way in which a few years ago he inspired someone like Shabaka, and now he is being inspired by Shabaka. Like, his most recent records are very much using some of the stuff that Sons of Kemet did as a springboard, and it's really interesting to see that sort of circular development of influencer becoming the influenced. But when Shabaka saw Soweto Kinch for the first time, it was at a small venue, and it was mind-blowing to him that someone was doing this experimental jazz with elements of hip-hop that obviously Shabaka, as a teenager by this time, was really into. And that really awakened something in him that thought, the language of jazz has so much of what I already learned as a child, and this is actually an exciting form to follow. So from there, he started attending jam sessions and listening to a lot more jazz records, and really that's where he really started to try and educate himself about the quote-unquote tradition of jazz, like all the free jazz that we all love, all your John Coltrane's and your Albert Eilers and your Ornette Colemans and whatnot. And it's that point, he says, that he really honed his work ethic. And he says, another quote here, "I think at an early age I recognised what needs to be done. For me it was a matter of, if I play this piece well enough, if I practice it every single day from slow to fast, then it's learnable." And it's this idea that, as long as he incorporates enough of the rules of all of these various things, he can then just rewrite them all in one kind of melange, So, fun note, he studied classical music at grammar school. So he didn't actually study jazz. Well, he did study jazz on the side, but he has quite a fun anecdote where apparently the staff at the school were saying to him, "You're going to have to quit this jazz because it seems like you're not fully committed to learning classical." And he kind of read it as being there was this sort of very kind of patrician establishment message being said to him that, jazz is not serious, classical is serious. And he says, quote here, "If they could have kicked me off that classical course, they would have, because they already weren't happy with me playing classical music and jazz. They were like, what are you going to do about this jazz problem? And I had to practice the classical stuff enough to make them get off my case, just so I could go, look, if I'm not playing the classical stuff well enough, then you can talk to me. But if I'm doing it, then what I do in my other time is my business." The journey towards Sons of Kemet, which I think is where he first becomes sort of solidified as an artist. He was playing with the aforementioned Melt Yourself Down first, which he described as a Nubian party punk band. And the other saxophonist in that is a guy called Pete Wareham, who for a few years prior had already been quite a big figure in the jazz scene. Some of his stuff is really good, by the way. And it's interesting that you can look at Melt Yourself Down. If you listen to Melt Yourself Down and the first Sons of Kemet album side by side, you can really see how Shabaka incorporated a lot of the raucousness of the party element, the punk element, and distilled it into what was already his sort of melange of free jazz, soca, carnival, party music with elements nodding towards hip-hop and nodding towards reggae. You can see how he incorporated that. It was a really important element. I think playing with Melt Yourself Down, you can see it finally unlocked the missing piece, and that's what he took to Sons of Kemet. And there's a lot of similarity between the first Sons of Kemet album and the sound of Melt Yourself Down, and it's interesting noting the evolution of the sound between the first two Sons of Kemet albums. It does become a lot more polished, but you can see that was the final missing piece. It was at that point he clearly decided, I'm going to be a band leader, I'm going to be the one calling the shots, and I'm going to solve that jazz problem. So the first couple of Sons of Kemet albums, they caught the attention of Gillis Peterson, of course, who is, for anybody outside the UK, Gillis Peterson is a hugely influential DJ and cultural commentator on not just jazz, but a lot of different forms of music. He's very passionate about hip-hop as well, and about reggae, and about grime, and...
Yeah, it's all the quote-unquote world music.
Yes, right, yeah.
Which is a term I've always found really weird, but, because it isn't all music from the world.
Exactly, it's an awful term and it needs to be destroyed. The 90s was the big era for that term. Yeah, awful. Burn it down. But Gillis Peterson is one of those people that there's a lot of these people who are sometimes culturally appointed as being figureheads. But Gillis Peterson is one of the few of them. Like, no, he genuinely knows what he's talking about, and he genuinely has an appropriate love for the things that he champions. And he's just a culturally very aware person. He was a huge champion of Shabaka Hutchings' music in those early days. As a result, the first couple of albums generated a lot of attention, and people were really, there was a lot of the cultural commentary, a lot of the kind of, by the time they started appearing in The Guardian, you know, that's that in the UK, that's when you know that they're definitely inching towards the mainstream in a way that the artist in question now has to be very careful about how they write their own narrative, because The Guardian will write it for you if you don't. The Guardian is a very middle-of-the-road liberal publication, historically left-wing many decades ago, but it's actually very middle-class bourgeois liberal, and it has a habit of sort of picking up on these young artists, and it's always artists of colour, and it's always artists of colour who are creating music that is quite groundbreaking in some way, and The Guardian love to kind of champion it in a way that makes it sound as if it should appeal to middle-class people to play as the background music for their dinner parties.
That is stunningly accurate, Craig. Good job.
And I think for a lot of young artists, this becomes a trap, because I think if you're young and you're a bit naive, you get sucked into the Guardianista circle, and you start attracting a lot of people around you who tell you that, oh, maybe you should try doing this, or maybe you should try doing that. It's easy to be judgmental about this stuff. I mean, I'm not going to name any names, but I can think of plenty of artists where people have said, why did that artist do that at that time when they could have done something way more adventurous, way bolder? And then sometimes you see certain artists years later, they start to correct those mistakes and they start becoming a bit more audacious. And then they start looking back and going, yeah, I shouldn't have done that, but I just had people around me trying to point me in different ways, and I was young and I was confused. And so it can be pretty dangerous. I think Shabaka by this point, though, was just old enough, and certainly more than smart enough, that he was never going to get inveigled into that circle. And I think it's interesting to note that from the third Sons of Kemet album, Your Queen is a Reptile, onward,
Such a good title.
the music and the philosophy of the band becomes way more militant. And I don't know how much of that is a reaction against what I've just said there, but I guarantee it's got to be an element. It's definitely an element. Because Shabaka is smart enough to know that, okay, I'm in the public eye now. There's a certain subset of the mainstream that are very interested in what I'm doing and are very interested in trying to guide me towards certain areas that I don't think I'm interested in. And I think part of that does always result in a certain kind of resentment. Just to be clear, I'm by no means saying that Your Queen is a Reptile is just a product of resentment. I think it's a product of a lot of things. But I do think part of the anger in it is certainly partly born from people being sure that they understand what the music is about, and Shabaka telling them, no, you don't know where this music came from. What's not lost in any of the subsequent stuff, so Your Queen is a Reptile, even though it has plenty of anger and lots of real vitriol about it in some ways, it doesn't lose any of the party atmosphere. It's still fundamentally a party record. And even though musically there's a lot going on in that album that veers a bit closer to free jazz, which I also quite like the idea that Shabaka is gradually saying to this young audience that he's attracted, saying, oh, by the way, there are, in case you're interested, there are even crazier shades of jazz. Let me just give you a little taste here, you know. And who knows, some of them may like it. But fundamentally, it's still that same party music. But it's party music that's... Do you know what it actually reminds me of? It reminds me of when Afrobeat was huge in the 70s and early 80s. It reminds me of Fela Kuti at his most political, because when Fela Kuti was at his most political, he was also musically at his most upbeat. His music, it was 100% party music. It was the kind of thing that you could get away with playing in the background of a Guardianista's middle class party, and then suddenly one of them would hear something being said, oh, wait a minute, this is quite radical. I actually think this musician might hate us.
Yeah, it's the spoonful of sugar that's been sprinkled on the fist that's about to punch you right in the nuts.
Exactly, yeah. The righteous fist of social justice. But yeah, it completely has that same energy for me, and that's why, you know, I feel that Sons of Kemet and Shabaka generally gets better as he goes on. I think he's introducing so many more elements. He's becoming way more assured as an artist, and he's not lost any of that vitality. One of the things I do think, I did mention it earlier, obviously in his teens he was obsessed with hip hop and reggae, and he was particularly, you know, a big fan of like Tupac and E40. He calls E40 the Eric Dolphy of hip hop, which I think is an amazing description. I don't know that I entirely agree, but I love that Shabaka thinks that. You know, and you can tell when Shabaka said that, that's not him trying to be clever. It's just that he genuinely sees free jazz and hip hop as existing in the same space in his brain, you know. And I love the fact that there's young people who will get into Shabaka's music because of the more accessible, upbeat side of it, and because of the nods to things like, you know, hip hop to reggae, and the fact that he's appeared on other artists who've inched him closer to things like dubstep. He will attract these young people who are into that stuff, and I love the fact he just hits out with phrases like the Eric Dolphy of hip hop, which will make a young person go, "Who the fuck is Eric Dolphy?" But for listeners who are not familiar, Eric Dolphy is one of the most radical people in the history of free jazz. These days he's mainly remembered as a sideman to people like John Coltrane and Charles Mingus, but he was a great band leader in his own right. But again, it's the kind of jazz, if you're trying to get somebody who likes jazz who doesn't like it, don't start with Eric Dolphy, because his stuff is radical, and it's the kind of stuff that for the uninitiated just sounds like a mad racket. To this day, Shabaka says he still practices when he's just relaxing and practicing his instrument. He'll play tenor along to the Notorious B.I.G. And that's just how he likes to relax. That's how he likes to refine his playing style. He says, and I do think this is a quite integral quote to understanding his musical approach, he says, "What I'm trying to do a lot of times on the saxophone is provide that role of the MC, not from a narrative perspective, but from the perspective of someone trying to provide this rhythmic relentlessness. When I step on the stage in Sons of Kemet, I'm not trying to be Sonny Rollins or John Coltrane. I'm trying to be someone like Capleton or Anthony B or Sizzla." Those guys are dancehall MCs. In terms of just the energy that I'm coming up with, that's who I want to be. My core vocabulary is jazz, but I'm not trying to have the energy of someone in a suit standing stationary in front of a microphone, giving a nice round sound. I'm trying to just spit out fire. And that's, for me, sums up what Shabaka does. He is that MC. But he's the saxophone MC who's also a bit of a shaman and also a bit of a philosopher. He manages to encompass all those things, mainly in his playing style, but there are some things that his playing style cannot do, of course, and that is transmit the specifics of his message sometimes. And that's why you get, in the first two Sons of Kemet albums, for example, some of the song titles are very explicit in what they're about. Like, for example, in the first Sons of Kemet album, there's a track called Song for Galeano, which is a reference to Eduardo Galeano, who is a Uruguayan Marxist philosopher and journalist, very radical Marxist, and he wrote his most well-known book is Open Veins of Latin America, which is still an essential text today. And it lets you know immediately that Shabaka is someone who is very left-leaning, very progressive in his politics, and that the music he's creating, you can approach it as just a soundscape, but he wants you to know that it means something else. And you can see now, as Sons of Kemet have progressed and they've incorporated more guest vocalists, reading between the lines, for me, this is Shabaka realising there's a limit to what I can do, what I can communicate just with my playing, and relying on someone looking at the title of the track. I have to do something else. And so I think that's been part of the natural journey of Sons of Kemet, is to get, well, you've got Joshua Idahen, for example, who's a great performance poet, and he's appeared on the last two Sons of Kemet albums, and his poetry is very right on, very political, and he's done some great stuff in the last couple of years, talking about things like Grenfell, for example. And so having him come on board with Shabaka and them writing together some of the stuff, on the two tracks he appears on Your Queen is a Reptile, man, straight up fire. It's the most righteous stuff you've heard since your favourite hip-hop MC from the 90s, whoever you want to choose. It's so righteous and so stirring and so completely unambiguous about its political message in a way that not even a Guardianista could misinterpret it. In addition to that, I do feel like the instrumentation of Sons of Kemet particularly has really solidified in a way from those early albums. Like those early albums, as I said earlier, the tuba was forming the bass essentially, And that is still the case. It's an unorthodox lineup, but for Hutchings, it seems to just be a natural arrangement. It's not something he set out to try and be clever about. Quote, I've never seen it as unconventional. It's just been that I wanted to play with those two drummers. He's literally meaning the personalities. He just liked those two guys and wanted to play with them. And in some ways, it was a split between a desire to play with two specific individuals and also a desire to take away the function of the drums as being the thing that provides the rhythm. That part, I think, is absolutely key in what makes Sons of Kemet distinctive. And as a drummer, I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah, absolutely. There's musicality in the drums of Sons of Kemet that is...
Yeah.
It's unusual for jazz, certainly, but it's really unusual for any sort of like traditional band setup. You know, the interplay between the two drummers is incredible. Which leads me to a question I was going to ask you, Craig. When did Sons of Kemet start performing live in their XL version?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it was post the second album. I think it was on that tour. So that album was released 2015. So I think it was post that.
Because obviously I saw them play at Primavera as an XL, and I think it was 4 drummers.
Right. They went full boredoms.
Yeah, that was incredible. I've never seen an audience at a jazz performance dancing solidly for the entire thing. It was like a metal gig.
Right, yeah. There's a lot of that energy as well. Where it's just a real free-for-all. It's a real liberating experience as an audience member. But yeah, what you said there, I think, is absolutely spot on. There's a melody in the drumming, which is something sounds like a complete non sequitur. But when you hear those two drummers conversing with one another, one is always doing the melody, and it's Sons of Kemet are not the first jazz act to do that, but I feel there's something very specific and distinctive about the way they do it. And one of the things I actually really enjoy is the two drummers get to switch roles from track to track. One of them will play the melody for one song, and then it'll be the reverse on another track. So they really get to show off their diversity, which is always really cool. The tuba is something I really enjoy more and more, and it's bizarre. It's not an instrument I thought I would get excited about prior to Sons of Kemet. But Theon Cross, who's incidentally is not their original tuba player, but he's been with them since the second album.
Right.
He is an amazing player. He actually, even now, if somebody had said to me a few years ago, here's a great album for you, the band leader is the tuba player, I'd be like, nah, mate, I'm all right. But Theon Cross released his own album as a band leader a couple of years ago called Faya, spelled Fyah. I highly recommend it. It's incredible. And the way he actually makes the tuba the lead instrument is insane. It's something that should not work, but it absolutely works. Do you know what it reminds me of? In some ways, he does with the tuba what Charles Mingus was doing with the upright bass in his combos. For anybody who's not familiar with Charles Mingus, he was a band leader and composer who was also the bass player. And the upright bass, generally speaking, is rarely the upfront instrument in jazz, but for Mingus, he made it the upfront instrument. Mingus was anything but a subtle player, I think we can say. He was an extremely aggressive player. And even on the gentler tracks, his bass is always up front. You're like, you cannot mistake. Also, his playing style was so distinctive. You knew, even when he was guesting on other band leaders' material, you knew instantly that's a Mingus. Here's the thing. I was thinking about this as I was writing these notes yesterday. One of the advantages, perhaps, that having a tuba player do this stuff over an upright bass player is that when you have a virtuoso like Charles Mingus on the upright bass playing the drone moments, where he wants the bass to drone, you can't really make an upright bass drone without having the constant thrumming of Mingus's fingers, which is cool. I love that. I wouldn't change it for the world. It's like jazz thrash metal. I'm all about it. But there's something kind of cool about the tuba being able to do all the bass stuff and then doing that drone without any additional acoustic interference, if you see what I'm saying. It's just the pure drone. And Sons of Kemet make great use of that. There are moments in Sons of Kemet where the party sort of is broke up for a while by something more resembling a war zone. And Theon Cross will just do these mighty, droning, blaring notes that are like, it's like a battle horn. It's like being summoned to battle. And it's just so exciting. It's so primal. It's just incredible. And you would not have the same effect if you were relying on the double bass to do that, for sure. One of the other things I would say about Shabaka's playing in this, over and above all the things that the other three members are doing, is that I do feel that with each subsequent Sons of Kemet album and his other project, Shabaka and the Ancestors, which I'll talk about momentarily, there's a lot of the time that Shabaka can definitely do nuanced mood. He can definitely do that stuff. It's interesting to note he doesn't do a lot of it in Sons of Kemet, and so where it does happen, it becomes so eerily evocative. And I'm going to mention a couple of specific tracks in a second. It's almost like you could be forgiven for thinking you're listening to a different player. Suddenly, like a different saxophonist has stepped in to play this part. It just sounds so completely different. And the way in which he segues between those different styles of playing on some of the tracks, there's nothing like it in contemporary jazz, honestly. And I'm including all the noisier free jazz that I like. There's just nothing as exciting as that kind of transition. At least I can't think of any other horn player who does that in the same way. I mean, all of the stuff that's going on in Sons of Kemet that we mentioned with the textures, with the tuba and the drummers, somehow Shabaka still dominates though. It's his sax that dominates above anything, and it's, you know, and that's what Sons of Kemet is, as I've said. You know, it is very much his band. So even though, and I think that's kind of amazing that you have all this incredible groundbreaking stuff going on underneath what he's doing, and yet somehow he's still the king of it. I was actually thinking, I see a lot of the time people talk about Shabaka Hutchings and Kamasi Washington in the same sentence. And I guess just because they're both prominent.
You know, they're both very visible in contemporary jazz.
And they both play the same instrument. And they're both band leaders. Stylistically, they're completely different. This isn't any shade to Kamasi Washington. I quite like Kamasi Washington. I saw him live, and his band were amazing live. But I don't think that what Kamasi Washington is doing is particularly moving things forward in any meaningful way. And I don't think he's pretending to either, so that it's fine, you know. I think what he's doing is he's very much paying tribute to the likes of John Coltrane in his latter period, / Albert Ayler in his mid-period, / Pharoah Sanders in his mid-period, and he's really celebrating that. When spiritual jazz was at its most vogue, kind of thing, and that's what he's exploring very strictly those parameters, and he's great at it.
He's fantastic. I'll listen to Kamasi Washington all day, but you're right, he's not pushing the boundaries like Shabaka.
Yeah, compared to what Hutchings does in terms of constant energy and innovation, they're on different planets. I was actually thinking, I made a note here that I wasn't sure about if this made sense, but I'm reading it now, and after what I've just said, I think it does make sense. I'm reminded of something Mike Watt of the Minutemen said some point back in the 80s or early 90s when he was talking about his love of Sonic Youth. Even though he generally dislikes kind of experimental punk music because he thinks it's all a bit artsy, and, you know, Mike Watt is very straight ahead, a hardcore punk kind of guy, and it sort of makes sense. But the reason he said, and this, for some reason this quote's always stuck with me, he said Sonic Youth were different because they weren't like those other guys playing head music. Sonic Youth was head music that you could still rock out to. And I feel like that's what Shabaka Hutchings does, but in the jazz version. It's head jazz that you can still party to. Alright, so I'm going to talk just a wee bit about some of the specifics of some of the music here. Some of my favourite tracks, some of the standouts. From the first Sons of Kemet album, Burn, I think one of the first tracks that really stayed with me was Inner Babylon. It's one of the album's most sort of Caribbean moments. Caribbean, if you're in a certain part of the world. We say Caribbean.
You have to remember, Craig, we have more listeners in that part of the world than we do in our own, so we should probably start using Americanisms.
Oh, God, no.
Prepare for aluminum.
If you start calling me Craig, I'm out here. So it's that way that it's very upbeat, but it also has a simultaneously dark groove about it. There's a real kind of militant rallying around it, and it's all working towards this real crescendo. It makes me think of like an anthem for the Maroons back in Jamaica, you know, fighting up against the colonists. It always has that sort of vibe for me. Yeah, it's a stunning track. It was probably always my favourite track on that first album, and it was the one I listened to most. I remember adding it to many playlists, including some of my writing playlists for getting inspired. But yeah, top tune.
Sons of Kemet, Inner Babylon. It's like a jazzy misery loo. Into it. Struggling to see why the video has one of Boris Johnson's bastard offspring and his pals reenacting Fire Festival, but okay. Main thoughts. Austin Powers would love this. The video has that when doves cry kaleidoscope effect that absolutely freaks me the fuck out. Could definitely cut a rug to this though. 7 007s out of 7.
What?
Did you?
What I'm doing?
Did you get that as well?
I did. I heard it sounded like an interruption from the HamilTron, but I thought the HamilTron was on holiday. We're without the HamilTron today.
Yeah, the HamilTron's on a holiday in Magaluf.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose we should have said at the start, but apologies, everyone, if this seems a bit shaky, this episode. We do not have the HamilTron strong guiding hand. Normally our professional AI is in to keep us right. But, I don't know what that was.
Where were we?
Yeah, I'll move on. From the second album, lest we forget what we came here to do. Lest I forget the title of the album. One of the great standout tracks from that is In the Castle of My Skin. Interesting note about that title, first of all, it's the title of a novel by George Lamming. George Lamming is a Barbadian novelist. That novel is basically a kind of coming-of-age novel. I actually have a quote about it from George Lamming. It's a great book, incidentally, but Lamming said about it some years after it was published, much of the substance of my first novel is an evocation of this tragic innocence, nor was there at the time of writing any conscious effort on my part to emphasise the dimension of cruelty that had seduced or driven black people into such lasting bonds of illusion. It was not a physical cruelty. Indeed, the colonial experience of my generation was almost wholly without violence. It was a terror of the mind, a daily exercise in self-mutilation, black versus black, and a battle for self-improvement. This was the breeding ground for every uncertainty of self. So the meaning of the title, In the Castle of My Skin, is, it's kind of referring to that way in which, as a colonised person, you become protective of your own identity, but it also becomes kind of a prison. And what I love about this track, you'll be able to correct me here, James, or inform me, there is a technique that drummers use. I'm not sure if there's a right name for it, but it's that rattling just right on the very rim of the snare. Is there a name for that?
There is a name for the actual technique, but I know the one you mean. But essentially what you're doing is you're counterweighting the stick on the rim of the snare, and it sounds almost like you're doing a drum roll one-handed.
Yes.
It's often used as a sort of basis for blast beats in extreme metal.
Right, it's the same kind of idea,
Yeah.
But one of the two drummers does that on this track, and it's such it's a very particular syncopated rhythm. And it's over it, Shabaka plays this really kind of curling, bopping melody, and it's like a kind of contradictory emotions rattling inside the cage of one's own skeleton kind of thing. Because the rattling of the rim of the snare sounds a lot like something rattling against the ribs, Yeah. And it's really got that sense about it. And one of the things I think solidified in my mind regards this track is they actually released a video for this track, which I'll link in the episode notes. But it's a group of dancers in a fenced off area, all black men, and they're all dressed in kind of dinner suits. And there's one more black man standing in front of them, conducting them as if he was conducting an orchestra. So he's conducting their movements. And it's almost like, the inference of this sort of self-censoring part that exists within each of these young men, telling like, oh no, you have to do this to fit in with the establishment, to be that horrible old phrase that racists like to trot out, one of the good ones. It's like that sort of thing, and some of the dancers are incredible. Like there's a real painful looking contortions that they pull off here, but it's a fantastic video to look at. But as they're doing that outside the fenced off area, there's this kid who's free and watching them and sort of conducting his own movements with a stick in his hand, and it's a really beautiful video. So yeah, that's a top one.
Oh, mere Muppets, Sons of Kermit, In the Castle of My Skin. Another crazy video. It's got those dudes that dance with the coffin, and they're all dressed like the MC from the Roadhouse. Is it the boot camp for coffin dudes? It's like a jazzy end-of-level boss fight song, or a 70s cop show set in San Francisco, starring Kermit and Fozzie, of course. Joyous. Or is it the weirdest orange walk ever? I'm no sure, but I like it. 7 007s out of 7. Well done, lads.
Sorry, I think I had my phone too close to the microphone there, and there was
Yeah,
some
I
interference.
don't know what's going on
Because
here.
the problem is I have my notes on my phone, so it's, you know.
Yeah, that
I'll
sounds
move-
about right.
Yeah, I'll move them away. Right.
It's weird. It went on for like a couple of minutes. There. I don't know what went wrong there.
Yeah.
It's almost like somebody was talking and saying things about Sons of Kemet, but I could be wrong. Anyway, where was I? Also on that same second Sons of Kemet album, there's a track called In Memory of Samir Awad, which is a reference to a young Palestinian man. Well, I say man, he was 17 years old, shot in the back by the IDF in 2013, and it's a very righteous sounding track, very angry, and again, it's one of those things. Shabaka leaving no one uncertain about where he stands on issues of social justice and whatnot. I love that track. I love that. This whole album flows so seamlessly well. Incidentally, there's something very cinematic about that second album that I don't think is true of the other ones. Certainly not true of the most recent ones. They're very less cinematic. They're very much told like chapters of a story. Also on this album, you get the double whammy of two tracks that segue into each other with no break. The first one being Long Night of Octavia Butler, and the second one simply called Afrofuturism. And I love the references there because I love Octavia Butler, and I'm also very into Afrofuturism. And I do feel like there's a very epic, sweeping sort of sound to both these tracks. And the way it accelerates into the second part, it makes Afrofuturism sound like something that's absolutely vital, that's something that's present, that's happening. I really like the momentum of it. But it's, those two tracks together, it's like equal parts adventure, thriller, and sound poem. There's so much great stuff going on in there. The next album, as I mentioned, Your Queen is a Reptile. Which, let's all face it, we love that title.
I don't think it's so tough to top that as an album title for anyone.
I remember when it was first advertised, the first ads I saw for it on social media, and I just remember punching the air going, yes, this is going to be fantastic. Shabaka has just gone full angry punk mode. There was all the jokes made at the time when the title came out. It's like, obviously it's a reference to David Icke. Yeah. Has Shabaka gone full David Icke? Is he going to start talking about flat Earth? But he did confirm very quickly that it's less that I call out, to the entire concept of that, all of that stuff, and just more a sort of call out to the entire concept of hereditary monarchy. And the fact that the reptile thing is a joke in popular culture is something Shabaka's well aware of, guys. It's meant to be funny. Yep. But he says about this, one of the myths that humans believe is that for some reason some people are born better than others. So for me to say your queen is a reptile is for me to say I have the agency to actually put forward a new myth that may not make any literal sense, but makes as much sense as her being better than me because of who her father was. And maybe it forces people to actually think about, well, who is my queen? Who do I consider my queen? Do I even have a queen?
Yeah, that's one of my favourite parts about the album title is it's not the queen is a reptile.
Yes,
it's your queen.
Yeah. Now, another thing I love about this album is all of this, the titles, the track titles. It's literally the same title with the name of a person changed, and that the track title is basically "My Queen Is," and then it's a woman's name. There are 9 tracks, and the opening track, "My Queen Is Ada Eastman." All of the other names mentioned in the album are recognisable women from history. Or indeed the present in a couple of cases. Ada Eastman is one you will not be able to Google because Ada Eastman is in fact Shabaka Hutchings' own great-grandmother. And he says that one of his earliest memories as a child is of Ada Eastman standing on the roof of her house in Barbados fixing a leak with a hammer. And at the time she would have been in her mid-80s. She in fact lived at the age of 103. And by the time she died, Shabaka says she owned 3 houses, despite not being able to read or write. She had worked until she was in her 60s, then moved to the States, where she worked as a domestic labourer for more than 2 decades, saved money the entire time, and sent it back to Barbados to provide for her family. And talking about this, Shabaka said, that's who I would say is my queen. That's the person that inspires me to get up in the morning and try to get better at whatever I'm doing. So that lets you know how serious he takes the idea of what he does. I think we've said this before about some artists, but it's the idea of making music not just being a creative pursuit, but it's labour as well. It's something that actually is creating something that improves material conditions. I'm not sure if this is my favourite of their albums so far. It's hard to say, but since it was released, it's the one I probably go back to most. The interplay between Hutchings and Theon Cross is unparalleled on this album. There's a lot of conversation going between the sax and the tuba. And then the drumming on this album, as I'm sure you're a massive fan of, I don't need to go into it. It's like tsunamis, just pure tidal waves of drums. It's incredible.
If you're not a jazz person, and if you're listening to this for whatever reason, because you think, I'll just listen to these two guys talk about stuff for a while.
It takes all sorts, and we welcome all of you.
Yeah, if you're a drummer particularly, just go listen to it. Immerse yourself in it. It's like a big rhythmic bath.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it. It is.
But it's a rhythmic bath that's also got a whirlpool function.
Nice, yep.
That you can't control.
That sounds like a madcap metaphor, but I 100% relate. So some of the other queens mentioned, you've got Angela Davis, you've got Harriet Tubman, obviously already well-known figures. The track My Queen is Harriet Tubman is another standout track, and Hutchings said in an interview, as I was listening to this tune, I just had the image of someone escaping slavery, escaping being in bondage. The feeling of having someone go, if you go down that road, if you meet me at this location, you can be free. How does that person run? What's the energy that person puts into actually getting from point A to point B? That person is going to really put all their energy into getting to that place at that time. And I love that that's him openly saying that he does think about these things sometimes in a cinematic fashion. That he had this tune, didn't have a name for it, and then just whatever was conjured in his mind thought, oh, that's the title. I love that kind of, it's almost, there's something very sort of childlike about doing that. Like, you hear a thing and it makes you think of a thing, and so you call it that thing.
I don't want to be the guy that always brings up Fiona Apple, but I'm going to be that guy.
Hit the klaxon. Fetch the klaxon.
Back in our Fetch the Shotgun episode, I did mention that when Fiona Apple was growing up, when she was learning piano, she did the same thing where she would imagine things happening and try and soundtrack it on the piano, and then take bits from National Geographic things she'd seen of wildlife documentaries and be like, what would that be musically? So it's, I think some of the more creative musicians and instrumentalists, can approach sound from that kind of cinematic angle. It's just great. Okay, that's enough Fiona Apple chat. Back to Craig.
Yeah, so some of the queens are historical figures that are a bit more obscure. So you've got Anna Julia Cooper, who was a scholar and an educator who was born into enslavement in the 1850s, I believe. She became, I think, one of the first African-American women who ever earned a degree. And she's actually referred to a lot as being kind of the mother of black feminism. Not often talked about, so it's one of those cool things that Shabaka does, that he draws people's attentions to people like this. There is also, I mentioned her earlier, but there is a track that's called My Queen is Nanny of the Maroons. I love this one because I love Nanny of the Maroons. It's one of my favourite periods in history. I've read several books about Nanny and the Maroons, and I do feel in a weird way, and I don't know whether it's just because it's one of those mental games that when you know a thing is called a thing, you just start thinking about that thing. But for me, it does conjure up absolutely images of that period and how the Maroons conducted their successful guerrilla war against the colonists in Jamaica at that time. There's just so much evocative stuff going on there. I could go on and on about the different queens, but we are short of time, so I'm going to move on. One thing to say, I do feel in this album, Shabaka's playing style not so much changes, but does start getting a bit more diverse on this album. There's just different tonal areas that he goes to that are not really present on the first Sons of Kemet albums. What I think is always worth pointing out about everything he does, though, and it's really, really prominent on this album, is just how little or almost no element of blues there is in Shabaka Hutchings playing at all. There's like this merest hint from time to time. But when you consider how steeped the history of jazz is in the tradition of blues, even a lot of American free jazz, as wild as it gets, a lot of it still has at its roots kind of blues structures, Yep, that 12 bar kind of holds things together. Yeah. I mean, I've mentioned Charles Mingus earlier, and he was one of the most inventive jazz musicians who's ever lived, but so much of his stuff was very based in blues. And it's interesting that Shabaka is creating almost a new lexicon of jazz for this era, and I think that's one of the things that's really important here about where jazz in the UK particularly is going, is it is creating a new lexicon of sounds, and it's mad that it's taken this long to do it. It seems like there's always been an arrested development, but I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about how things got stymied in the late 80s, early 90s in terms of sort of establishment culture's attitude to jazz and how it could be incorporated into popular music. So it's interesting it's now been freed. And while Sons of Kemet is not strictly free jazz, it is free in the sense that it's freeing itself from one of the big paradigms of established free jazz. And to say established free jazz sounds almost like an oxymoron, but it's only when you get out decades later and you realise, no, there actually were strict things still going on in most of what was called free jazz. One of the things they did as a promo for this album is they actually combined the first and the last track into a remix, and it's the two tracks that have Joshua Idahan doing his poetry over, and they do seamlessly make it into one track, and they just called that track Your Queen is a Reptile.
Your queen asserts this message to her crown, her church, her parliament, her loyal subjects, her wealth, her relationship with the media and the British Empire, who in turn celebrate her lifestyle, her fashion, her cuisine and her culture.
And they made a video for it, and I shared the shit out of that because it was great. And I remember at the time in 2018, where there was a royal wedding, let's not forget, I was posting that shit everywhere. Your queen is a reptile, and getting lots of angry reacts from mad monarchist douchebags.
It's the only react they know how to do.
It is, yeah. I mean, I'll fully admit the laugh react is about the only one I know how to do. But it really encapsulated a lot of what needed to be encapsulated in that album. It was an ingenious form of promotion. The remix of those two tracks into one actually works incredibly well.
Sons of Kermit once again with Your Queen is a Reptile, featuring Joshua Idahan. This is the shit. It's got that fat man walking trumpet sound I really like. Absolutely loving the guy's poem as well. Your history is not pure. Your empire is not whole. Your conscience is not clean. Your money was printed in blood. Your high horse is three-legged, and your royalty wears no clothes. And your queen is not our queen. She does not see us as human. And we know what we came here to do. We know the system is rigged, and the only path to freedom is for the system to burn. And then it really kicks in. Absolutely loving it. My queen is Harriet Tubman, Ya Asintewa, Anna Julia Cooper, Doreen Lawrence, Ada Eastman, Alberta Sisulu, Angela Davis, Nanny of the Maroons. Your queen is a reptile. 700 007s out of 7. Fantastic.
Which brings us up to date, Sons of Kemet wise, with their most recent album, Black to the Future. Again, a good pun title, although not one they came up with. That pun has been used by many people, I think, over the years, but it's still pretty great. Black to the Future, for me, is one of the most vital records of the last couple of years, and I think, and I know we've discussed this in the podcast before, James, with regards to the way popular culture has reacted to and or reflected and or been evocative of the way in which the discussion about racism in the 21st century and the legacy of colonialism in the 21st century has been very much in the zeitgeist. It's been very much something people are talking about in a way they weren't talking about 10, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And this album is very much of a piece with it. It's a vital text to go along with that conversation. More collaborators on this album than Sons of Kemet have had before. As I was saying earlier, I think Shabaka is realising more and more that he needs to get more words in there in the actual tracks. So Joshua Idahan comes back. We also have Koji Radical, great London MC. I love that guy. Yep. DEE, Grime MC, is on there. Moor Mother is on there. Your favourite and mine. Yep. Easily the most apocalyptic artist.
She's got the album coming out shortly, right?
She does, yeah, very soon. It could even be out by the time this episode gets out. So yeah, and she, for me, she is another one on my list of artists that I would love to do one of these podcasts on, because there's so much to say about her. Mm-hmm. Such a multifaceted artist, and everything she does, lyrically, she's incredible. A true Afrofuturist poet. And so just having her on here for the one track she's on is just such a treat. Actually, the track Hustle, the one that Koji Radical appears on, they chose that as their first single. It also has Leanne LaHavis on it, which I did not immediately realise. She's the very quiet female vocal in the background.
All right.
Yeah, so I didn't realise
not
that.
know that.
I didn't realise that for ages. There's so many things going on in that track that I really like. Just in terms of the collaborators themselves, first of all, Koji Radical is his family is from Ghana. And Leanne LaHavis, her roots are from Jamaica. And so I love this idea that Shabaka is combining all the different parts of the African diaspora, you know. So the Caribbean and the African continent combined. And this line in Hustle, the main line is born from the mud with a hustle inside me. And all about the durability of the black spirit. And God, it's incredible. It's so great. All the lyrics in that song are so good. Koji's delivery, oh man, I love that guy's voice so much. It was a great choice for the first single because it's such a catchy party number. Yep. When you first hear it, you think, oh, that's got a great danceable beat. And then you realise just how righteous the lyrics are. It's like, oh man, this is, again, it's that Fela Kuti thing. It's right up there in that sort of echelon, if you like. It exists in that same part of my brain.
She Return of the Muppets. Shuns of Kemet. Hustle, featuring Koji Radical. This one is fantastic also. The dancers are incredible. The video, a mixture of Attack the Block and the Blair Witch Project. Fucking terrifying. 700 007s out of 7. Essential viewing for all the listeners out there.
Oh, Angel Bat Dawid is also on it, who I know I've mentioned before. Incredible American jazz musician, great band leader in her own right, who supplies vocals on the track. How's this for a title? Pick Up Your Burning Cross. This album is awesome, man. It's such a satisfying listen. It's so righteous. It's such a punch in the face of all the reactionary sentiment that is, you know, it's no secret by now that in the last few years, the right wing has become so much more emboldened. And now, of course, we've got we call them gammons over here, people of a certain age and a certain pink complexioned white person who gets extremely upset about the woke crowd and anything that threatens their very insular view of what the UK was in their this fictional UK that supposedly existed decades ago, that they had actually had no part in building. Yeah, there's something Union Jack biscuit tin bullshit. You know, this is a big punch in the face to all of those people, and I love every single second of it. But again, I can only reiterate, musically, it's all very much a continuation of Shabaka's evolution and this band's evolution. I would love to see more of it. I'm short on time. I'm going to close with some stuff about Shabaka's other band, Shabaka and the Ancestors. Yep. So in 2016, Shabaka Hutchings launched a whole new band who seemed so completely formed, and the music they were doing was so complex that I remember thinking to myself, does this mean Sons of Kemet is on hiatus? Woods, you fool! Shabaka and the Ancestors have now released 2 albums, but the first one, Wisdom of Elders, was released in 2016, and we should say that arrived at a time of when there was already some really kind of intense political, racial tension, if we can use that shitty phrase. Not just here, but of course in the States. Let's all remember how Kendrick Lamar captured that zeitgeist at the time, 2015, 2016. And that's when Kamasi Washington really hit the mainstream consciousness as well. And there was this idea that their records were really emblematic of this sort of revolution in jazz in the US specifically, because Kendrick was using a lot of jazz elements. Right? And there was this idea that jazz is becoming righteous, it's going to become very mainstream. That didn't quite happen in the States in the way that I think a lot of critics hoped it would. But where I think it is, as I've said, beginning to happen in the last few years is here in the UK. And I think I do feel like Shabaka is sort of hermetic in the way he approaches his work. Like, I don't think anything he does is in reaction to what Kamasi Washington was doing by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think there was an inevitable factor in the way that Shabaka went on to explore similar sort of themes using very much a spiritual jazz kind of template. And that is what Shabaka and the Ancestors is. It's much more in the vein of spiritual jazz. And you know what? Going off from what I was saying about Kamasi earlier, it's interesting that Shabaka can do spiritual jazz as well and yet still make it progressive. Because he's essentially occupying that same territory, but everything Shabaka does is Afrofuturist. He's the ultimate Afrofuturist musically, and there's a lot of what is going on in the Ancestors' work is very much about looking forward and about. And James, you better hit a klaxon again, because I'm going to say the old thing that I love saying. It's about approaching history and the future as being part of the same circular cycle. And Shabaka has spoken about that openly. This isn't me talking out my ass. But he has spoken very openly about the history of Africa culturally being very much a history of cycles, and that originally African people across the continent did always view the passage of time as being a circle, and that's very much a key component of the aesthetics of what he's doing with this band. I'm going to bypass talking about the first album though, because again, short of time, I really want to talk about the second album, their most recent one, which I know you agree is a jaw-droppingly amazing record. Mm-hmm. There's so much to say about this record that I'm not going to have time to say, so I'm just going to try and sum up what I think are the key points.
If anyone's interested in hearing our thoughts on it, it did feature in our end-of-year list.
It did last year, yeah. It was easily my favourite jazz record last year. This idea of, and you do hear people all across the black diaspora talk about this a lot, about communing with the ancestors. Shabaka has kind of taken that in a literal way, but talking about it very poetically through the music of this band. And it's almost like he's viewing he and his band as ancestors in the present tense. That he's very aware of his place in history, that at some point down the line, he'll be somebody's ancestor. Mm-hmm. And this music really is all about occupying those liminal spaces, really interrogating that idea of communing with the past and the future simultaneously.
Is it future?
Yeah, the old Mike from Twin Peaks drop. There's a way in which a lot of the forms of the music that he's exploring here are very rooted in what we think of as the past, but again, he's pushing them forward in ways that he's very much pointing to what jazz might become, how spiritual jazz might find a new place. Because it's funny, spiritual jazz is one of those things that is looked upon now as being a bit archaic, yet at the time it was seen as futuristic. Pharoah Sanders, who I mentioned earlier, was one of the main progenitors of it. He was seen as being a very futuristic kind of guy, and people would mention him in the same breath as Sun Ra. He wasn't quite as intergalactic as Sun Ra, but he did have that same sort of philosophy that he was very much looking ahead. But I think where the difference is Pharoah Sanders was always very optimistic. His perspective was an optimistic one, that as in to say, as long as we avoid bad shit, we can create a better future. Whereas what Shabaka and the ancestors seem to be saying is, the bad shit has already happened and we're living in it. And no matter what happens now, because time is a cycle, we're always going to go back through it again. The idea is, how do we fight against it, and how do we make sure that there is always going to be something better on the other side of it? So you have to accept that the awful things will happen, and you have to be prepared to fight them. And it's that same energy that Shabaka has taken from Sons of Kemet. It's that militant side. That's still present, and he sees that as an inevitable part of the cycle of history and the cycle of the future. You don't win anything by not going to war, seems to be his message.
He's doing what Ornette Coleman was suggesting. This is the shape of jazz to come.
You know what? You're right. Yeah, that sounds glib, but you're absolutely right. Ornette Coleman, actually, incidentally, since you mentioned that, I was going to correct something I said slightly earlier about even all the free jazz of the States being very much based in blues. I think Ornette Coleman is maybe the closest any of them got to removing themselves as far away as possible from blues. Sorry, Ornette, I just wanted to correct that, wherever you're listening from beyond the grave. The musicians in Shabaka and the Ancestors are all pretty much from South Africa, and it's very much Africa-centric, very much Africa-focused, and it's all about centering the idea of the future as being specifically African, and it's about trying to correct the idea of Africa belonging in the past, which is the way that white supremacist culture kind of views it. The culture that we all grew up in, we all kind of view it as being a bit backward, a bit stuck in the past, a bit tribal, and never coming back it's never going to arrive into the present, and what Shabaka is saying is, we already had a civilization before you fuckers came along, and it's like, it's all about finding a way back to that, but not in terms of going back in time, but in terms of creating the future, So yeah, all of these ideas are really extremely exciting for me. I love the way in which the music and the aesthetics of the music of this band do such a great job of combining all of those great traditional forms with some real experimentation. We have to mention as well the vocalists in this combo. Man, it's spine-chilling. Absolutely spine-chilling. I mean, it's easy to believe you're listening to the voices of the ancestors, as Shabaka puts it. They feel like they're recordings from centuries ago, and at the same time, they could feel like messages from the future, you know? There's something very, very vital. I should say as well, some of the phrasing is in English, and some of it is in Zulu, and some of it is in other African languages. So, you know, Shabaka and co are not making it easy for us sad sacks who want to immediately understand everything. You've got to make the effort, you know. But I do feel like the music, not all of it, but certainly some of it is accessible enough that, you know, if it piques your interest, you'll look into it and you'll say, oh, so that's what that means, you know. It invites you in. It's a generous piece of work. And I feel that's something that Shabaka is generally, is he's a generous musician. He wants to present you the complete smorgasbord of all his influences and allow you to have your boundaries dissolved the way his were at a very young age, and that allowed him to approach music this way. And to have such serious subjects approached, because the second Shabaka and the Aztec album, you could describe it as being apocalyptic. It really does deal with the idea that this might be our last chance, guys, you know, and it's no longer about averting disaster. The disaster's happened, it's how do we deal with it. It's very, very urgent, it's very necessary.
It does seem like a warning from history and a warning from the future simultaneously.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And it's, you know what, actually, you could sum it all up in the aesthetics of the music video that they put out for the track Go My Heart, Go to Heaven. That video is something else, man. Oh, you know what, I'm not even going to describe it. Just go to the episode description and look at it. But you have all these really beautifully shot scenes of these people in these deep red robes delivering these urgent messages from the past/future. And they have these expressions that are equal parts fear, just as equal parts sort of sadistic joy. And it's this idea that the warnings exist in an almost amoral space where the onus is on us to make things better. But if we don't make things better, there's this kind of more malignant force in the future that's already happy that we didn't. It's really quite spine-chilling in a lot of ways, but it's so beautifully shot. The music is so beautiful and so rousing. I do feel like Shabaka is most at the peak of his creativity. You can kind of say that you can look at this video and say, yeah, this is sort of the pinnacle. And not necessarily the best thing he's done, but it kind of sums up what he's all about. It's a great kind of broad statement about who he is as an artist. And it's very much all about Africa being seen as the location of both final rest and rebirth, you know, and the pendulum swinging back, the circle continuing. What kind of future comes next?
Shabaka and the ancestors, go my heart, go to heaven. There isn't any rest, there isn't any peace. Release my body from its enchantment with the earth. Go my heart, go to heaven. Yes, bashy as fuck. A post-apocalyptic Pink Panther theme in the video reminds me of Dead Ringers, The Handmaid's Tale, or Ush. Finishes up with a trip to Glastonbury Grove, or the setup between two ferns, I'm not sure. Into it. 6007 out of 7.
Okay, I feel, was that a message from the future or the past? What was that, James?
I feel like it was simultaneous.
Somebody hacked us. Has Elliot Alderson hacked us? He's playing a prank.
I definitely think there's a virus in the absent space that the HamilTron was usually in. So
yeah, we better get the HamilTron back in. Toot sweet, because things are falling apart here. So, to sum up, just real quick, I guess I think I've explained all the reasons why I think Shabaka Hutchings is vital. But I think fundamentally, jazz really is all about breaking boundaries. That was supposed to be what jazz was about. Its accessibility, you could argue, is a separate question. Should jazz even need to be accessible? That's a complicated discussion that's gone on for many decades, and it's not something either of us are going to solve. I think for myself, jazz has proven time and again that it can be accessible, and that if you give people credit to actually open their minds to stuff, they will open their minds to stuff. But at the same time, you cannot force people to like stuff that's just absolutely outlandish, and that they, like I said earlier, you can't just ram Eric Dolphy in somebody's ears and expect them to react positively. I wouldn't expect anybody to react to that positively. I think what Shabaka Hutchings is doing is, without making it his mission, he's created an accessible form of jazz that's naturally accessible simply because it's very generous in how it approaches culture, in the sense that Shabaka has no idea almost the boundaries even exist. To him, hip-hop, reggae, R&B, free jazz, these all exist in exactly the same spaces in his brain. And that's part of the reason why I gravitate towards it, because for me, all those things are kind of true as well. But I absolutely recognise that culture has imposed certain boundaries, and that there are always clear class distinctions where these boundaries are concerned. And that's where one of the big stumbling blocks is, and I sort of alluded to it earlier in my Guardian chat. As to how you continue to battle that, I think the answer is you continue to encourage artists like Shabaka Hutchings. And I think Shabaka himself is also doing that for other artists. And one of the things I didn't mention was he also curated a couple of compilations just a few years ago for Brownswood Recordings. And so you had people like Moses Boyd, Nabaya Garcia, incidentally, just nominated for the Mercury Prize. And, so he's shedding light on all these artists that might not otherwise have that kind of light shed on them. And I mean, granted, someone like Nabaya Garcia, by and large, is a bit more accessible than a lot of what, certainly compared to Shabaka and the ancestors. But she's still a very durable player, and I think she's going to do a lot of interesting stuff in the future. So, the fundamental thing I think UK jazz generally is really vital, and why Shabaka is the vital figurehead of it, even if he didn't necessarily set out to be, is that these are young musicians who grew up, for sure, studying all the Herbie Hancocks and the Wayne Shorters and the Miles Davises, but they also had that affinity naturally for R&B and hip-hop and dancehall, and there never was that imposition of, there being an idea that these things should be separate. And in a weird way, I think maybe growing up in an era where there was that idea that jazz was a distant thing that was no longer part of mainstream culture might have actually helped. So I'm not sure if it's a double-edged sword where, yes, the relationship between jazz and mainstream atrophied for a long time, but perhaps one of the benefits of that happening is that there was a generation was allowed to grow up with none of the bad associations with jazz. So I do feel there is part of that that's come out on it. But yeah, I mean, for those older crusty jazz heads, and by the way, they do exist, who don't get on with Shabaka at all and are very resistant to the idea that jazz should be mainstream, I have to say to you guys, you're not even listening, because it should be about the music. And I think you have to get yourself out of this idea that because something has been popular, it automatically is bad, because that is literally the point of view of a 15-year-old metal fan.
Yep.
It's like, oh no, my favourite band have sold more than 20 million records, I don't like them anymore. It's like, dude, grow up. It's like, are they still making good music? Is it still interesting? You should be glad that people like it and people are opening their minds to it. This is a good thing. It's never a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if the mainstream act in question then starts to dilute their sound, and that's not what Shabaka has done. As a matter of fact, as I said earlier, from Your Queen is a Reptile onwards, he's sort of done the opposite. That's exciting. It's something that deserves to be supported. Jazz did not end for good when Miles Davis decided to go electric or Herbie Hancock decided to go funk. And anyone who thinks it did could go funk themselves. But anyway, yeah, I hope that clears it up on why Shabaka Hutchings is a vital presence.
Absolutely. And I think that just about wraps it up for another episode of fSkronkiety.
I think you're right. Doodle pip.
Good ep.
Good ep.
Yep.
Good ep.
This guy sure know a lot about jazz, especially that Craig guy.
Top jazz discussion. Longer ep than usual, I felt.
Yeah, slightly longer, but I mean, you know, it's jazz, isn't it?
It was like one half of Charles Mingus's Black Saint and the Sinner Lady.
Well, before we continue with anything else, I think I'm going to need to hit the bar and get a refill.
I think I'll join you.
Am I around?
Sure, why not?
It's been that long since we've had a bar break that I've forgotten whose round it is, so let's just say it's mine. We'll be right back after these short messages, you hip cats. What are you drinking tonight, Craig? And when I say tonight, what I mean is this afternoon.
I'm still drinking the Camino del Angel Malbec. It's going down a treat. James, are you still on the coffee or have you gone alcoholic?
I'm still on the coffee right now.
Ooh. Christina Aguilera gift.
There's a few bottles of Slavery Apologists Green King's East Coast IPA in the fridge, though.
To reiterate once again, the good kind of slavery apologists.
They apologised for their role in slavery. But yeah, I'm still sticking to the coffee right now. I'm having a barista break, if you will.
Well, before we dive into any further coverage of whatever you feel like talking about, is there any other cultural things, music or otherwise, that have been grabbing your attention of late? Since that's what we commonly do in the bar break, I have forgotten that since it's been so long since we've done one. We decided not to break the dream of Twin Peaks, as David Lynch would say, so we put all our stuff at the start of the podcast. Now it's back to the middle. This is a retro episode.
Well, I'm afraid I've been suckered in once again, haven't I? Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. Because, god damn it, I saw the trailer for The Matrix Resurrections.
Oh, right.
And I am 100% down to watch the shit out of that movie.
I suppose I'm not surprised by that.
Lana Wachowski's got me by the short hairs. And worse than that, do you know what they did? Have you seen the trailer, I should ask?
No, I didn't watch it. I know that it's around, but I've not seen it.
Do you know what they've gone and done? They've only gone and also used White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane as the music.
Oh my god.
And I am a sucker.
Okay, if they don't also have Don't Fear the Reaper on there, then they've failed.
I am an absolute sucker for anything that has White Rabbit in it, so I'm down.
Right. This might sound crazy to a lot of people, but I've not even seen the second and third Matrix movies. I never watched them.
Well, I've been doing a rewatch of the Matrix trilogy recently. I watched the original, which to my mind still stands up as a great action movie. It's up there in the upper echelons with Aliens as far as I'm concerned, which is an echelon where I place movies where I may not include it in my list of favourite films, but like, so listeners, my favourite film probably of all time is Inland Empire, so it's going to come as a surprise to nobody. But honestly, if you said, do you want to watch Inland Empire or Aliens, I'd probably watch Aliens.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Matrix is up there in that sort of echelon.
This might shock you further. I've actually only ever seen The Matrix once.
Oh.
And it was like in 1999, I guess.
I love it. I think it's great.
So I don't remember it that well, I'll be honest. Well, I say I don't remember it. I mean, obviously the osmosis of it never really disappeared from popular culture.
Yeah.
But
The second one, not as bad as I remembered it being. Rewatch Matrix Revolutions some point next week and then revisit the Animatrix, and yeah, I'm down for getting back into the Matrix.
I keep forgetting the Animatrix is a thing, and it always makes me think of the Animaniacs. Okay, love you, bye.
But in terms of watching, that's about it. That's my visuals of lately. How about yourself?
The only thing I've watched lately is a Mexican TV show called Soldiers or Zombies, which I only discovered was a thing like literally 2 days ago. And I saw the title and I saw that it stars Fatima Molina, whom I love, and I was like, there's no way I am not getting every bit of this absolute garbage in my eyeballs right now. And so it was 8 episodes of complete nonsense involving a US government experiment that TLDR firstly creates pig zombies. And I think I said to you, they buried the lead because it should have been called Zombie Pigs, because that's, how could you not mention that in the title? And yeah, basically a bunch of I won't get into detail, but a bunch of US soldiers get turned into zombies, and they are pitted against I just released Mexican criminal's former drug lord who's now trying to go straight, and he's the good guy in it. It's mad in that way that only Mexican stuff could be absolutely mad. 8 episodes, and honestly you could have removed about 3 of them because they did not advance the plot in any way whatsoever. I was fine with it because it meant more time with Fatima Molina, but her character you could have removed most of those scenes and it wouldn't have affected the plot at all. I was like, I don't know why this is in here, but whatever.
That sounds great. I'm gonna have to check it out.
It's nowhere near on my list of favourite Mexican shows. Who Killed Sarah is still my favourite one. But yeah, I don't regret watching it.
Yeah, it sounds like the sort of madcap nonsense that would be right up my street.
Oh, you would love it, yeah.
Shall we get our sad faces on and do a quick press F?
We should.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, it's impossible not to mention. So we've not recorded a podcast since before the very, very tragic death of Michael K. Williams, who one of our truly great actors. And I say our, I'm not American, but I mean our, because he gave so much to humanity in terms of what he did for the landscape of entertainment. I'm still broken up about it, man. It's one of those. It's rare. It happens sometimes, but it's rare for a celebrity death to hit me to the extent that where days go by and I suddenly remember it and I go, no, man, that can't be real. How can it be that I'm never going to see that guy in something new ever again? This fucking sucks. But yeah, what can you say about Michael K. Williams? We kissed his arse more than enough on our Lovecraft Country commentary last year. But one of the true greats, man. I mean, he brought such presence to the screen.
An incredible dancer, an incredible actor, and by all accounts, just an incredible human.
He seemed like a great human being, yeah. And it was interesting the last few years, really watch him find his voice in terms of, in interviews and stuff, being a lot more open about how he was thinking through political issues and stuff like this, and feeling braver about talking about that kind of stuff. And such a great guy. And he did not ever give a performance that I thought was anything less than fantastic. He was always spellbinding on screen. You know what, actually, all of my feelings I felt could be summed up by an excellent piece I saw written by a guy called Matt Zoller-Seitz on Vulture, of all places, which is not generally the place I expect to find exemplary journalism. Yep. But it was actually a fantastic obituary, which I'll link in the episode notes. I'm just going to quickly read a bit of it, because this sums up exactly how I felt about it. And in fact, it sort of chimes with the post I made about Michael K. Williams on our social media after he died. It says, it's a rare actor who can locate the universal in the specific and the specific in the universal in role after role and scene after scene with such assurance that the story of one man becomes the story of a people. Williams was that calibre of actor. He made a point to see himself in others, and that helped others see themselves in his characters. He carried that weight and he made it. That's how the story should be framed. Michael Kenneth Williams made it. He made it into his 50s despite an overwhelming, sometimes paralysing addiction. He made great shows, great movies. He gave some of the greatest performances in the history of television. He told his story by telling other people's stories. He made it. It's a beautiful tribute, and I think it's absolutely true. The whole piece is very lengthy, and it goes into some great detail about Williams' different projects. It's a very respectful piece. I highly recommend reading it. But yeah, it's hugely tragic, and I'm not over it. There
was one thing that I found really nice was a tweet that Riz Ahmed made about Michael K. Williams, talking about when they were shooting The Night Of together. Yeah. And the tweet is just, this is part of a thread, but I'm just going to read this one tweet. Tough week shooting The Night Of. He's told me he has the afternoon off, but I don't. End of the day, I'm in my trailer, and I see he spent his time off buying me the nicest and probably still most expensive jacket I own just to give me a boost and show me some love.
Oh, man.
I mean...
That's fucking beautiful. I'm not too proud to admit, that's just brought a tear to my eye, literally. God damn it.
What a guy.
Oh. No, rest in power, Michael K. Williams. Never forgotten. I'm never going to not enjoy watching him, and I'm sure I'm going to rewatch him pretty often for the rest of my years. Yeah. Great actor.
That's really good.
Great human being. Alright, so moving on, is there anything more upbeat to sort of divert our attention from the abyss?
We need something upbeat but brief. We need something that slaps and doesn't overstay its welcome. You know where I'm going with this.
I think I know the thing. Wait, James, is this an episode of fHipHopriety? The podcast in which we discuss all things hip-hop and related rap music genres?
I think it might be, Craig. Why don't we cue the music?
Cue the music.
Hello and welcome to another episode of fHipHopriety, the podcast within a podcast where we talk about all things rapping music. and doing that thing that we talk about oftentimes. Craig,
Talk about those rappers that they have now.
on our previous episode, we spoke about some new rap that came out. Most notably, Little Sims's incredible new album, Sometimes I Might Be Introvert.
AOTY.
We belittled some of the more mainstream hip-hop that came out in terms of your Drakes and your Kanyes and why people should just not give them the time of day. And literally a couple of days after we recorded that episode, which for us was not long ago, it was 1 week ago exactly we recorded that episode. But a few days later, who goes and drops a new album?
Young Tommy Genesis.
Indeed.
Yeah, and it's pretty great.
Goldilocks. Is it Goldilocks X or just Goldilocks Kiss? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm just calling it Goldilocks,
Yeah.
and if Tommy wants to correct me, by all means, she can do so.
She can have her number.
Tommy,
She can hit
if you're
us up.
listening, which I know you are, just hit me up.
You can join the Skype call next time, Tommy. It's
That would be amazing.
yeah, it comes in.
Just under half an hour.
Yep.
She's not messing about.
It absolutely slaps. As I tweeted, wham bam, thank you, Tam.
Yeah, so listeners of previous episodes will know we've talked about Tommy Genesis before, but I'm the guilty party in getting you into Tommy Genesis
Yes, you are.
way back at the World Vision era, 2015, 2016. And yeah, she's always been one of my faves because I just like that she was a bit of an oddball who a lot of dude bros said couldn't rap, and quite often when dude bros say that, I immediately think I'm giving that person a listen. And I love Tommy Genesis' rapping style. It's true she's not the most technically advanced rapper, but she has a very particular style that is all hers, and she's doing some very unusual things with her flow that nobody else is doing. I will say, James, well, I'll let you go first. You had a catch-all description of this album after you listened to it.
Oh yeah, it's the All the Time by Jesse Lanza of fetish rap.
Describe what you mean by that, because I know that you mean that your thing about Jessie Lanza is that she shows basically no progression as an artist, but she does it really well.
She found her niche. Jessie particularly found her niche in her second album, and does what she does better than anyone else. And because she's in that space, she's like, you know what, this is what I do, so deal with it. And I feel like Goldilocks is exactly that. I feel like Tommy's found her space, and she does a subgenre that she, for all intents and purposes, invented herself.
Yes, yeah. There's nobody else doing it.
Yeah, and now she's crystallised that.
I partially agree, but I suppose you could make the argument that, I mean, she is doing that, but I think I would make the argument that she's actually broadening the sound of what that self-made genre is a little bit, because there are a couple of things on here that she's not done before, like the closing track, for example. Hurricane is basically like a kind of lo-fi alt-rock ballad, but without the rock part. And it doesn't sound like anything she's really done before. There's also a song called Baby, which is literally just an R&B breakup song. I say just as if I'm belittling it, but I'm not. I mean, it literally is. It's remarkable because it's her doing it. And that's not something I've particularly heard her do, like either lyrically or sonically. I mean, production-wise, it's very much a natural progression, or non-progression, depending on your point of view, of what she did prior. But yeah, the songs on this are so enjoyable. I mean, where she's rapping, you're right, none of that is different.
Okay, by the way, I should absolutely jump in here and say to clear up any misapprehensions, I don't mean that as a criticism.
No, I
at
know.
all. Yeah, I think it's a great record, and everyone should be spinning that right now. There's no reason that Tommy Genesis should not be massive. She certainly should not be in a position where she's liking my tweet about how good her album is. You know, she should be way above that.
Listen, she does that all the time. She's always done it. Like, anytime you mention her, you don't even need to tag her, because I think she's one of those people that looks for where people have mentioned her. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it in the sense that she just likes to sort of communicate with people, and she likes to give. I think she just enjoys giving people likes and whatnot. She's just one of those people. Actually, I'm sure I said this to you, like back in 2016 or something. On Twitter, I shared a couple of messages with her on Twitter. And she was just one of those people that just reaches out and just likes to talk to people. She's a wee bit bigger now than she was then, but I think she's pretty cool with her fans.
Yeah, she seems like a totally cool, really nice person, and she's obviously not the person that her musical persona is. It's like, you know,
yeah, her musical persona is way more aggressive than I think she is in real life. Yeah. Some of the stuff going on here though is really fun. If there's one word I would describe this album, it's fun. It's just a fun listen. It's a breeze. If you want to de-stress, this is actually a great record to listen to. But some of the more aggressive songs on it are just, they remind me a wee bit of Rico Nasty. And it made me think, and I remember saying this to you, I'd love to see the two of them collaborate. The song Manifesto, I also noted, has tons of MIA references in it, in the lyrics. And Tommy Genesis, should say, is half Tamil, and you know that seems to be something she and MIA bonded over. And MIA did kind of take Tommy under her wing a few years ago, if you remember. So yeah, it's quite cool that she's put that in as a tribute. The song Average is also a shouty, a real aggressive kind of trap number that is also got big Rico Nasty vibes for me. I also really enjoy the song Men, in which she just repeatedly says fuck man, and I'm like, yes. Fuck man, we're the worst.
So good.
But yeah, she's also kind of got a very similar energy to Shy Girl. And Shy Girl is a UK artist who's like, her music is like equal parts grime and experimental electronica, but her delivery is as a vocalist she's sort of like the English Tommy Genesis, and her lyrical subject matter, it's kind of similar, and she's equally aggressive. And I did actually see, which was quite exciting, a couple of weeks ago, somebody on Twitter said, I forget which track it was, but somebody said that this Tommy Genesis track absolutely demands a Shy Girl remix, which Tommy Genesis retweeted and tagging Shy Girl and said, I'm game if you are.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, please make that happen.
I saw that tweet. That would be great.
So yeah.
But yeah, so if you've not checked it out for whatever reason,
8 5s out of 9.
Yep, definitely. Go check it out. Go listen to it. It's half an hour. It's less than half an hour.
Yeah. You'll be glad you spent that half hour on Tommy Genesis' company.
Yeah, I think we all would be.
If you're so thirsty, why don't you just get up and get yourself a glass of water, huh?
Have you picked up on any other good hip-hopping lately, Craig, in the past week?
The only other hip-hop record released in the last week that I wanted to make mention of was the new L'Orange record called The World Is Still Chaos But I Feel Better. L'Orange is an incredible producer. He's one of the few hip-hop producers whose stuff I will just listen to the instrumental stuff. Like he doesn't need an MC. He picks such great samples and constructs such amazing tracks that, you know, it's a cinematic experience listening to his stuff. He's one half of the duo Marlowe with the MC Solemn Brigham, and their stuff is amazing. But L'Orange has been going for a long time before they got together, and every single one of his records is great. But yeah, he's not. It's a case of it ain't broke, this new record, but it's him doing all the stuff that he's great at, and it actually gets 9 5s out of 9 from me.
Wow, I am absolutely going to check that out then for sure. The highest rating one can get from our weird 5-9 rating system.
Our weird Mr. Robot themed rating system that is so cool that it needs to be fucking explained every single time.
Do you know what?
We definitely picked a winner.
Do you know what? If you don't understand the rating system, just go back and listen to one of our earlier episodes where we explain it.
Start from episode 1.
Yeah.
I think that wraps it up for another episode of fHipHopriety.
Toodle pep.
Doodle pip. Good ep. Those guys know all about fetish rap.
Yes, they do.
Alright, James, I'm going to hand over to you. You've picked an artist whom you think is vital to the contemporary landscape. Who is that artist?
Well, Craig, the artist I've picked is... Wait, is this an episode of... What did I call this? fSobrIDMety? The podcast within a podcast where I talk about electronic music.
I guess it must be.
God,
Cue the music.
Fucking music. Before we begin, I'd like to just take a moment to say I despise the genre name IDM, because it goes back to what you were talking about earlier about the sort of Guardianista kind of approach to music, where IDM seems like Guardian readers allowing themselves to enjoy certain electronic music by giving it that title. It's because it stands for, if anyone doesn't know, intelligent dance music,
Right, yeah.
Which is-
It's so condescending. Yeah. What elitism 101.
Yep, background dinner party music. You know. The second is, if it's good enough for Solange, it's good enough for me, because the artist I'm going to be talking about today is Scotland's own Boards of Canada.
Oh, how about that? How about that? Well, how about that?
How about that?
Did not see that coming.
Yep. For those unfamiliar, this is also similar to what you were talking about with Shabaka Hutchings and specifically Sons of Kemet. Boards of Canada are a band I assume everyone knows about, but they're really not. But they're so all-pervasive in electronic music circles that I just assume that they're mainstream, and I really don't think they're particularly mainstream.
Yeah, that's probably fair.
They are, however, if you were to look at my Spotify listenings, they're probably my most listened band, or most listened artist, because they are an artist I can go back to again and again and just play and just like immerse myself in the music that they make, which is weird because if you said who's your favourite band, they would probably they'd be on the list, but they'd be pretty far down, but they're very high up in the list. It's like the Inland Empire versus Aliens thing. You know,
This is going to be the catch-all metaphor for this episode. I see.
maybe that should be the episode title. Inland Empire versus Aliens.
That is going to confuse everyone.
Yeah. So how are Boards of Canada? For those unfamiliar, Boards of Canada were formed by two brothers, Marcus Owen Sanderson and Michael Sanderson, although Marcus Owen Sanderson dropped the Sanderson from his name because early on they tried to cover up the fact that they were brothers. They formed in 1986 in rural East Coast Scotland.
I had not realised it was as early as that. Jesus.
Yeah, they've been making music basically since they were like 12.
Fucking hell.
Yeah. They began actually making music when their parents moved to Canada for a while, unsurprisingly. And while in Canada, they saw a lot of films by the National Film Board of Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
Hence where they get the name from. When they lived in Calgary, they would watch these films and then try and soundtrack them, essentially. And from that point on, almost their entire career has been soundtracking Film Boards of Canada films.
This might be a dumb question. Has the name Boards of Canada ever caused him any issues with the Film Boards of Canada?
It hasn't, actually. For some reason, like, the streams have never crossed as far as I could figure out. Although it might have, but and I've just not been able to find out about it.
I mean, I don't know why it would. It's pretty obvious that a musical artist is in no way impinging on the activities of the Film Boards of Canada. But I was just one of those things. I wondered if there was any.
It is entirely possible because, as we will find out, it's very difficult to find out information about Boards of Canada.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they are deliberately oblique in their presentation of themselves as people and as an act.
I was just thinking there. I was talking about the band Salt a couple of episodes ago.
Yes.
Salt are the R&B Boards of Canada.
Absolutely, yeah. I've actually got a note of that in here, but I don't need to say it anymore. Yeah, they're very secretive, rarely do interviews, almost never play live, and yet somehow have become this sort of pervasive force in electronic music. And basically, in the early 1980s, they started making Super 8 films based on what they saw the Film Boards of Canada create, and then soundtrack them. And then they eventually formed an actual band when they were older. So originally, Boards of Canada was a more traditional, quote-unquote, band setup. They went through about 14 members until they settled on a 3-piece. But by the time they actually got famous, it was they just got back down to the brothers. Sound-wise, they present what Dua Lipa would call future nostalgia. It's this very futurist version of nostalgia for a sort of 1960s and 70s washed-out, day-glow, hippie kind of vibe. Everything they do is saturated in nostalgia, but still, very forward, kind of thinking, forward-looking. They have been hugely prolific before they were even known. They have been making music since 1986, and they have apparently an entire vault Prince style of songs that they made up until they actually eventually got signed to Scam Records. But before they were signed to Scam Records, they formed their own music label called Music 70, where they would make tapes and just distribute them to friends and family only. Some of these songs are collected on later releases called A Few Old Tunes Volumes 1 and 2. Great naming.
I like the simplicity of that title.
Yep, and one called Bach Maxima. All of those are available on YouTube to listen to, should anyone be into it. And it's interesting to hear like the sort of seeds of where they were going to go. Mm-hmm. Eventually they made their first quote-unquote commercial EP to release on Music 70, which was an EP called Twoism. They pressed 100 copies, distributed them to friends and families, and then sent a handful of them to their favourite artists. Mm-hmm. And Sean Booth from Autechre, not Sean Booth from Autocorrect, as my phone has ironically autocorrected it to,
It's like rain.
received a copy and immediately signed them to Scam. And from there, they released the High Scores EP.
What year are we talking here?
High Scores was released in 1996.
Okay. So there's been quite a long period of gestation before these EPs.
But yeah, they spent literally a decade just like forming this sound. And
Gotcha.
around the time of the release of High Scores, the third member of Boards of Canada left, a guy called Christopher Horn, who would go on to make music under the name Christ.
That's how you attract attention.
Yeah, he's very kind of well respected in that kind of underground electronic scene
Well,
as well.
I hear he has a cult following.
Yeah. But you know what? The press have been unkind to him, though. He sure gets crucified. Whoa. Sorry,
Yeah.
Alan, if you're listening. Didn't mean to bring that up.
Why would Alan be listening? He's not here. Wonder where he is.
Who knows? From this EP that they released on Scam, this was like their first kind of introduction to the mainstream, and the mainstream's first introduction to then. Up until then, it was very much a very kind of underground, chin-strokey, people on the earliest internet finding out about them on websites kind of thing, you know? This is a few years before I even knew who they were.
Yeah.
But they released the High Scores EP and released their first single, Everything You Do Is a Balloon. Put a link to the fan-made YouTube video, because most of their videos on YouTube are fan-made because they think they've only ever made 2 actual music videos.
I did not know that.
Yeah. But yeah, Everything You Do Is a Balloon got them a lot of notice.
Boards of Canada. Everything you do is a balloon. Okay, so we've got a Super 8 video here. Oof, Dewey from Malcolm in the Middle's looking rather rough. And has you learned Semaphore? Whatever. Suddenly we're in Little Rascals of the Apes. Ah, this whole video reeks of nostalgia, bringing me back to the 90s. After a slow start, the gang shit off to a funky ash beat. What's this? Arseface of the Apes. Goodness. Kinda reminds me of that German forklift health and safety video. Hilarious. Everything you do is a baboon. I'm gonna say this is 3 minutes too long though. A little boring towards the end for my tastes. Sorry, James. 5 double Sharons out of Sharon.
So from there, we get to the point where I actually...
James, before you continue, what did you get some dropout there? Why does this keep happening? Do you know what this is reminding me of? It's reminding me of something that would happen in a Nigel Neal play that is exactly the kind of thing the early Boards of Canada reminds me of.
Legit. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I just keep
some
getting
radiophonic workshop type jazz.
Yeah, I just keep getting these weird dropouts. But you know what? I'm sure it won't happen again, Craig.
Yeah, I think we're fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, carry on.
So, this brings us up to the year 1998, where they released their first full-length album on Scam/Warp. They get co-signed to Warp by this point. And we all know Warp. Warp is Autechre, Warp is Aphex Twin, etc., etc. Warp is Square Pusher.
I can't believe you forgot Vincent Gallo.
I forgot Vincent Gallo had a music career entirely.
Well, I think career has been generous.
They released their debut album, Music Has the Right to Children.
Yep.
And around this time they did a session for John Peel where they did 3 tracks. They did Aquarius, Happy Cycling and Olsen for John Peel. And
Sweet.
that was released as an EP itself. And it was that EP was my first encounter with Boards of Canada, because my flatmate at the time, Ian, a man we both know,
Yep.
he bought it and he would play it incessantly.
Colour me amazed.
And and I just remember thinking, like, what is this fucking weird Sesame Street music you're listening to? Why is there this instrumental hip hop with a sample of like a child saying "that's right" and a woman with a Sesame Street voice counting?
Yeah, I love that track.
It's incredible. The counting on Aquarius, that's a big clue into Boards of Canada's psyche, because like I said, they were very oblique and they managed their public persona very much to the point where they are perceived as very satanic by a lot of their fan base, and there's a lot of aspects of like numerology and stuff in there as well, and witchcraft. When we get to the album Geogadi shortly, that's just a fucking mess. Like, it's incredible. But at this point, they still had their numerology obsession. So apparently the counting on it, the numbers add up to 69 at a certain point, and then sometimes the phrasing is cut up of the voice, where the voice will say 60-10 instead of 70 and stuff, and it's really weird.
More Boards of fucking Canada. Aquarius. It's nice to hear John Peel's dulcet tones at the start of the video, though. I miss him. Slapping the bass, man. Again, taking me right back to the 90s. Once more, though. The Boards of Canada have a song which is 3 minutes too long. Boards of Canada. More like Board of Canada. Am I right? Also, my favourite part, the bass, disappears, or is it just too low in the mix for my old ears? 4 007s out of 7, an extra half 007 in there for John Peel's voice.
So that sounded like something occult just happened there, James. I don't know if
satanic.
Are Boards of Canada putting some kind of hex on our podcast or something? What's going on?
Oh, I don't know, Craig, but it's funny you mention hex, because one of the things that Boards of Canada are known for is their obsession with the hexagon shape. One of the early rumours about them is that they were part of a weirdly pseudo-religious art cult called the Turquoise Hexagon Sun, which is one of the names of one of the tracks on Music Has the Right to Children. But according to Marcus Owen, the hexagon theme represents that whole idea of being able to see reality for what it is, the raw maths or patterns that make everything. We've always been interested in science and maths. Sometimes music or art or drugs can pull back the curtain for you and reveal the Wizard of Oz, so to speak, busy pushing the levers and pressing buttons. That's what maths is, the wizard.
I like it.
Yeah. They're also heavily influenced by the Illuminatus trilogy.
I knew that. Robert Anton Wilson.
And apparently they love the sound of music that seems barely under control. Their approach to making quote-unquote electronic music is that they tend to try and create their own instrumental sounds by using kind of more traditional instruments. They'll play any instrument they can get their hands on: drums, guitars, clarinets, basses, trumpets, and they'll just incessantly play them into samplers and then destroy the sounds as much as possible. And then they tend to do this before they even have an idea for a song structure or a melody, and then they'll just use those samples, running them through old broken tape machines to try and create the sounds. So it's all very analog, and so it's pretty fucking time consuming if you ask me.
It's pretty laborious.
But around this time, this sound of theirs that they create was hugely influential to stuff like even stuff you hear nowadays, like your synthwave and sort of the 80s throwback kind of electronica. There were so many acts around this time. Not going to name names, but there were so many acts around 1998 and the early 2000s that were so Boards of Canada light that it was hysterical.
Yes, yeah. I can think of one very specifically that became massively successful.
There were a lot of live to Nirvanas, around, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good comparison.
It was around this time I think they played their last ever live shows, because I think they just decided, who knows, maybe playing live was giving too much of themselves away. Which brings us to their whole sort of descent into their fan base starting to think that the band was just, well, I say starting to think, the band themselves were seeding this. But
Yeah.
Boards of Canada fans, you know this, Craig. You know some Boards of Canada fans.
I believe I'm talking to one right
Yes,
now.
if you look on the internet, boy, Boards of Canada fans, they like to solve puzzles.
Yeah.
And Boards of Canada love to present puzzles. And this whole idea of them being this pseudo-satanic, weirdly religious, cultish figures started to really come to the forefront during the release of their 2000 EP, A Beautiful Place Out in the Country. The lead track of A Beautiful Place Out in the Country featured vocals singing a line supposedly spoken by Amo Bishop Rodin, the widow of the Branch Davidian sect leader George Rodin,
Okay. Yeah.
which says, come out and live in a beautiful place out in the country. Which when they were trying to essentially get people to join the Branch Davidian sect, they'd go on to use more Branch Davidian themes heavily on their next album. Yeah, a lot of rumours started flying around about who exactly and what exactly Boards of Canada were and what they were doing. And then Giugaddi dropped in 2002, and it was hysterical because there was no publicity for it whatsoever. There was no lead up to it. It was released without promotion, with live plays in 6 churches around the world to launch it. In Edinburgh, Paris, Berlin, New York, London, and Tokyo.
Amazing.
In each of the churches, slides of children playing of sunsets where the sky is bent into a hexagon were projected onto the altars, and all the prayer books in the churches were replaced with small turquoise hexagons.
Oh, that is incredible.
Giugaddi is a ridiculous puzzle of an album. It might be my favourite Boards of Canada album. It is described by Marcus Owen as exorcising demons. They'd set out to record a dark album, and while they were doing that, 9/11 happened. He says a few of us were in the studio that day and ended up glued to the TV. I think the months following that pushed us to make a darker record, like I'm sure it did with a lot of other bands at the time. And Giugaddi is a dark, dark album. It's mathematical, biblical, and satanic. If you look for reviews around the time of Giugaddi, one particular, my favourite review line was, "The evil is blatant on this album." The track lengths on the album correlate to biblical verses. It contains samples of the Conet Project, which is a kind of numerical thing. We should put a link to the Conet Project. It's hard to explain without really us being here all day. Julian Candy features samples from the George A. Romero 1973 film Season of the Witch. It's one of my favourite songs on the album.
Once again, James hits me with Boards of fucking Canada. I wasn't a big fan of them back in the day. I've come to appreciate them a little bit more now that I've had to listen to them a few times here, but still not really for me, I'm afraid. Julie and Candy. Okay, what to say here? It's got that fucking kaleidoscope effect again. No, sure, I don't like it. I think the message of this whole video appears to be drugs are bad, okay? It's got that Picnic at Hanging Rock meets Valley of the Dolls thing going on. Once again though, I'm going to say 2 minutes too long. 4 out of 7.
Wait, was that...
I'm just going to ignore whatever that witchery is.
I think that was a sample from the George A. Romero film.
Just Boards of Canada just sent us some samples. I think they sent the wrong file.
Yeah.
Maybe we've got it in the wrong format.
Weird. How sinister this song is becomes way more sinister when you realise the song title is a reference to the year 2000 murder of Candace Elmore, a 16-year-old girl, by a quote-unquote attachment therapist named Julie Ponder and several others during what was called a rebirth ceremony, where the girl Candace Elmore was smothered to death. It's a horrific story that is, if you look it up, it is grim.
The more you're talking about this, the more it's making me think I really want Boards of Canada to soundtrack whatever Prano Bailey Bond does next, the director of Censor.
Yeah, that would be fucking incredible.
I think that's what we need.
As horrific as Julian Candy is in content, though, it slaps. Tune
Yeah.
slaps. Another song that slaps is 1969, which is one of the more uplifting sounding songs. It's got a vocodered lead vocal line on it, with two of the words reversed, which when unreversed says, although not a follower of David Koresh, she is a devoted branch Davidian, which refers to Ammo Bishop Rodin once again. There's the song You Could Feel the Sky, which features reverse mumblings of a god with horns, a god with hooves.
Sweet.
So there are people who've reversed the entire album and put it on YouTube.
I can hear Mary Whitehouse just rotering away.
Yeah, this is like pure 1980s satanic panic reverse messages. Like they really leaned into it in this album. So much so that the final track in the album is called Magic Window, and it is 1 minute and 42 seconds of silence. Which,
That's right. Oh, I remember that.
yeah,
That's right.
Which brings the runtime of the album to 66 minutes and 6 seconds.
Yeah. I do remember noticing that back in the day.
The IRC number of the vinyl is not a true IRC number, but is in fact the binary code for 666.
Oh, man. Hats off to this kind of effort.
Yeah, it's a pure rabbit hole of an album that continues to confound and terrify listeners to today, if Reddit is anything to go by. I went on Reddit to see, like, what's happening, and oh yeah, Boards of Canada Reddit is like the musical version of Twin Peaks. It's incredible. The Boards of Canada subreddit is just is like obsessive dorks. It's incredible. Yeah. And then nothing for 3 years.
Yeah, it was quite a gap. Is it the Campfire Head Phase? Is that the next one?
That is correct. 2005's The Campfire Head Phase was a much lighter, much more uplifting album, which they deliberately set out to do. It's to make a far less dark album.
If I could interject here just a wee bit, just my own personal experience with this band, I was really, really into that first album, and to this day, whenever I hear any tracks from it, I get so excited, and it takes me right back to a very certain time and place where I was. I liked the second album as well, and I remember buying it when it came out. And then when the third one came out, so that'd be 2005.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember listening to it a couple of times, and it wasn't. I think somehow it wasn't what I wanted.
Yep.
And so I never really gave it much of a chance. I'll openly say that's what happened, and then I just hardly listened to it again. And from then on, I kind of fell off what they were doing. So it's at this point I kind of diverged from them.
It is funny you say that though, Craig, because at the time I was not a fan of this album at all. It wasn't what I wanted. I wanted it to be an advancement of Giagadi. I wanted them to go crazier into the weird mathematical satanic like nonsense. And I wanted it to be a frightening listening experience, which, to be fair, they would eventually revisit with Tomorrow's Harvest, but we'll get there.
Yeah.
Campfire Head Phase, on the other hand, was a live guitar and drum heavy album, lighter, uplifting.
Yes,
It featured their first official music video for the track Day Van Cowboy, and it spawned a spin-off EP called the Trans-Canada Highway EP. And again, around this time, I kind of fell off Boards of Canada a little myself. I didn't buy this album. I'd heard it a couple of times. I didn't buy the EP. I didn't really give it the time of day. On revisit, recently, I quite enjoy it. But it's still my least favourite of the albums, but I find it a more enjoyable listen than I did. However, someone that we both like clearly was into this album.
Yeah, I do have distinct memories.
Yep. This is a good point to drop in the track This Bird by Solange from the album Saul Angel and the Hadley Street Dreamers.
Yep.
Where Solange took the track Slow This Bird Down from the Campfire Head Phase and just used it as the track to sing over, and it is absolutely stunning.
Yeah, this, I will say, this was like my one major engagement with this album was this remix. You know, weirdly, it did not make me go back and revisit the album, though. I've still never really done that.
You know, it didn't do it for me either, because Solange absolutely uplifted that track and improved upon it, and I can't even listen to the original now without going, that's just not as good.
But whatever I do, I'm not gonna slow this bird down. I don't wanna look like Bindi. I'm not gonna fall face first in the spiral called alive. I'm not in denial. I'm not suicidal. Not an alcoholic. I'm not a heroine. So just shut the fuck up.
Boards of Canada, once again, slow this bird down. It's got a somewhat Lynchian start to the video. It's like we're in the in-between place. Keep expecting to see a Special Agent Dale Cooper floating down through the sky. One thing, majestic heckin' birds. Bit of surfing at the end too. Surfing bird. At 6 minutes and 9 seconds, it felt like the shortest one yet. An improvement on the others. 5 007s out of 7.
Anyway, where was I? This is getting ridiculous.
Hanging out with Solange's lawyers.
Yeah.
Cross line, couldn't make it out.
Not the only time that she would do that though, because I think it was on her SoundCloud in 2011. She did the same with the track Left Side Drive from the Trans-Canada Highway EP. So clearly Solange is, liking her Boards of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, I didn't really dig it that much at the time. I still like it now to listen back to it, but it was maybe my least favourite album of theirs, because what I wanted at the time, and this is a good time to talk about Hell Interface.
Okay.
Hell Interface, also known as Boards of Canada under a different name. Basically, Hell Interface consisted of a few remixes and a lot of really weird dark music, and I think I wanted a Hell Interface album far more than I wanted the Campfire Head phase. But not everything they did was weird and dark and horrible, because possibly one of my favourite pieces of music of all time featured on the Scam compilation Mask 500 from 1999 is Boards of Canada's Hell Interface remix of The Midas Touch by Midnight Star, which is
that's right, yes.
Just chef's kiss.
Yeah, that is pretty great.
Yeah, because all they do is they just, like, the structure is identical. All they do is they just lift the lead vocal and the ding sound, and then just do like a little track under it, and it's just so much fun. Around the time they also remixed Trapped by Colonel Abrams. I feel bad mentioning these, but the reason I'm mentioning them and I feel bad about it is because we can't include either of those tracks on the jukebox playlist because neither of them are on Spotify. But we can perhaps put the originals on, because the originals both slap as well.
Yep, fair dues. Yeah, I remember looking for the Solange remix ages ago, and then seeing it wasn't on Spotify, and was like, well, fuck you, Spotify. Not for the first time.
Yeah. The reason, however, that I mention Hell Interface as well is because it'll become important shortly. Going back to Fetch the Shotgun, our previous musical episode, I appear to have a fondness for artists who will not release albums for a long fucking time.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Because it was 8 years later, past the Campfire Head phase, that on Record Store Day, April 20th, 2013, someone found a almost unmarked 12-inch record by Boards of Canada. Now, before I go into this, this is why I think Boards of Canada are vital. Not only because Solange likes them, so that's vital enough for me.
Solange is definitely the arbiter of what is vital, so you could have left it there, but carry on.
So few artists are this mysterious, but invoke this much fuckery in their fan base, that I just find it absolutely incredible to read about it. So what I'm about to tell you is an abridged version of what happened in April 2013. Record Store Day 2013, someone found a 12-inch by Boards of Canada in a record shop, which the entirety of the track on it was some distorted synth sounds and a mechanical voice reading a 6-digit number. Turns out 6 of these 12 inches were released across the world.
Holy shit.
4 of them were found, 2 of them were never found. One was found in Avalanche Records in Edinburgh, one was found in, I think, Rough Trade in London, and another one was 2 of them were found in the United States. The owner of Avalanche in Edinburgh says that he had no idea it was there. It just got delivered suddenly one day with a sticker on it that just said "Sell Me" and a barcode.
That's amazing.
And a Boards of Canada fan found it and paid $7.99 for it, because it turns out the barcode that was attached was the barcode for Music Has the Right to Children.
Oh, wow. That is amazing.
So yeah, it contained a 6-digit code, and that was it. And no one knew what the fuck was going on. However, at the same time, the official Boards of Canada YouTube channel started leaving cryptic messages as comments on fan-made Boards of Canada videos.
Okay.
Through a series of like very, very difficult to understand clues These comments led to an unlisted video on the Hell Interface YouTube channel on
Holy shit.
on a video called Nuevas Similas. Nuevas Similas linked to another numerical code in the comments. And not a second six.
This is like something out of Mr. Robot.
Yeah, a second 6-digit code. Oh, sorry, I've skipped a bit. The vinyl cover of these Record Store Day vinyls had like 6 sets of 6 blank digits separated by slashes.
Mm-hmm.
So people were like, okay, there's 5 other series of 6-digit codes. We need to figure out what's going on here in order to figure out this code. Mm-hmm. On the evening of the 23rd of April, BBC Radio 1 in the evening session broadcast another set of numbers as one of the tracks, just in the middle of 2 tracks. And at the same time, or the same day in the evening, NPR in the US played another one of these 6-digit codes. So Boards of Canada fans were on this like mad Easter egg hunt now, where by this point they had, I think, 4 sets of 6-digit codes. Adult Swim, the same night, broadcast a short video that revealed the positioning of the 4 currently released 6-digit codes in this sequence.
Jesus.
Before the 5th set of numbers was found, but the 5th set of numbers, how it was found is too complex for me to go into because I don't understand how it was found. But to summarise, sorry, I realise this whole bit, by the way, this is most of my Boards of Canada chat because I can't believe this happened. I kind of remember it at the time and not understanding it, and I still don't really get it. There was an image on an unofficial Boards of Canada website where if you decoded the source code for that image, it had 2 lines of code, which then led to another image, which then decoding the source code for that revealed the 5th set of numbers. And all official and unofficial Boards of Canada websites, as it turns out, redirected to a single website where the source code within that website revealed the 6th set of 6 numbers.
Fucking hell.
And people solved this, Craig.
That's insane.
Yeah, like the Boards of Canada, like message rooms where people just trying to solve this, and somehow people figured this out. And once they figured out the positioning of it, and the 36-digit code was the password for a website which revealed the title and release date of their new album. And that was it.
Oh man, that is amazing.
And that was how they released the title for Tomorrow's Harvest and the release date. And people lost their shit. And then it gets worse. Because
or better, depending on your point of view.
Because that's when the band debuted only their 2nd ever music video for the track Reach for the Dead.
Okay, Boards of Canada. I'm sensing a theme with James's choices here. This one is Reach for the Dead from Tomorrow's Harvest. Watching the video, and it's as I suspected. Flat Earth confirmed. Where's the curvature? Wake up, sheeple. Into this one though. Droney. Shit fucking slaps. Like a druggy beatnik Knight Rider theme song. An experimental pilot episode for a new Incredible Hulk TV show. The title though definitely reminds me of Woody from Toy Story. Reach for the sky. There's a snake in my boot. Somebody's poisoned the watering hole. My favourite of the Boards of Canada ones so far. 6 007s out of 7. Lovely party.
I don't know what that was, but it sounded like the Dead were trying to reach out to us. Gonna have to call somebody to sort this out, by the way. Get a tech in.
We
here.
need a tech guy or an exorcist.
A texorcist.
The band debuted the video for Reach for the Dead on a billboard in Shibuya in Tokyo. Someone filmed this happening and then it went up on Boards of Canada's YouTube channel and a bunch of other YouTube channels. Now, I'm not sure, I don't think it was on the official Boards of Canada channel. I think it was on one of the fan channels that copied the video. The Hell Interface YouTube channel commented on that video, May 27, 1700 PDT.
Oh, God.
Then the Boards of Canada official Twitter account retweeted that as an image. And the XGIF data in the image revealed a GPS location of a road in California.
Holy shit, that is amazing.
They then tweeted a video for a now defunct water park called the Lake Dolores Water Park, which led people to believe that on this road in California, at the site of the now defunct Lake Dolores Water Park, something would happen, and people went there on May 27th, 1700 PDT, and they're set up in the middle of the desert in a defunct water park, with a few people from Warp Records setting up was a listening party for Tomorrow's Harvest.
That's amazing. That is hats off, that is incredible.
A few days later, Warp Records did a one-off internet stream of Tomorrow's Harvest a week before its release. So all these people who'd heard it a couple of days before had travelled to the middle of the desert, and then schmoes like me just jumped on the internet, set my Audacity up, and I fucking recorded that when it was streamed.
Oh, your Audacity was way up.
Don't worry, we're almost at the end. That's my Boards of Canada talk.
I know, this is almost like listening to you narrate a David Foster Wallace fucking novel.
Tomorrow's Harvest is the album I wanted them to follow up Giugaddi with. It's the dark, desolate, and weird album, and it might be my favourite Boards of Canada album. It was described by Marcus Owen saying there's a definite theme on the record, without blowing it all for the listeners, because in a David Lynch style, I want people to ask their own questions and come up with their own answers. But he says, there's a core to the album that's about an apparently irreversible vector we're already on as a species. The world population has doubled in my lifetime. If you really let that fact sink in, you start to realise why it is that in so much popular culture, in books, in movies and television, we're fantasising about a depopulated world in one way or another. He says, musically, it's about finding beauty in desolation, because it's too easy and naive to make music that is purely dark. You have to find hope in it. So what they've done is they've created a doomsday album. And it is incredible. But the best thing about the album Tomorrow's Harvest, Craig, and we're going to have to link this in the description for the podcast, is one particular quote-unquote review of the album done by a man we've mentioned in this podcast many times, which is Lemmy's review of Tomorrow's Harvest.
Yeah, I'd actually forgotten about this.
On one night on one of his streams, pre-Twitch, back when he just did it on, I can't remember what it was, someone suggested, listen to the new Boards of Canada album. So Lemmy chucked it on his stream and created an entire science fiction movie narrative based around this as being the soundtrack, which is a beautiful full circle of Boards of Canada creating imaginary soundtracks for films.
Yes, yeah.
And then Lemmy creating a film based around their imaginary soundtrack is just beautiful. But it's a work.
All our postmodern national treasures coming together, free form, to create some sci-fi narrative. I'm all about it.
Yeah, if you've never heard Tomorrow's Harvest, I'd recommend listening to the Lemmy review first before you listen to the album separately. So
here's the thing, and I can't remember if I said this earlier, but I've never even listened to Tomorrow's Harvest because I fell off that much that I just didn't listen to it. And there was no animosity in my not listening to it. I just didn't. It was one of those things I didn't make time for, and so I just didn't get around to it. I jokingly said to you earlier, James, about our mutual friend Ian, that when that album was released, he would not shut up about how great it was. And then in a weird contrarian way, that made me less inclined to listen to it, because I'm like, Ian won't shut up about this album. I'm sick, fed up hearing about it, and it actually put me off listening to it. And now here we are 8 years later, and I've still actually never heard it. It might be time to change that.
At least you stick to your guns.
I hadn't set out as a point, to not listen to it, but it was one of those things. I was sick, fed up hearing about it, and then I just never get around to go back and listen to it. But I'm more enthused to do so now.
Yeah, I would honestly recommend making Lemmy's review your first listen of the album.
All right, I may well do that
then. The science fiction film that he comes up with is called 3, and it is chef's kiss.
Fantastic. Wasn't Nicolas Cage's twin brother an adaptation? Wasn't that the title of the script he was writing? I think it was The Three.
Ah, do you know what? I think you may be right. I don't know if that's a related article.
Who knows?
And since then, nothing. No live shows, no more interviews, no more singles.
No secret codes,
Yep.
or maybe they've been so Byzantine in how they've tried to go about their marketing that nobody has picked up on
they
it.
might have released like 2 new albums and just no one's seen it. The only thing they've done since then was they did a 2-hour DJ set / mixtape, the Warp 30 broadcast, celebrating Warp Records' 30th anniversary. The mix they did is called Societas X Tape, and it's on YouTube, and it's just a really, really good mix. I suspect that if they are going to release another record, they're probably trying to figure out a more nonsensical Easter egg hunt than they had previously. Or maybe they'll just do a Giagadi and just drop it with nothing. But either way, I enjoy their consistent approach to absolute fuckery. And I love the music they make. I think that they are often imitated, never equalled. They make mysterious, elegant, beautiful music, and if they're good enough for Solange, they're good enough for me.
That works for me. What I would add to that is I think the kind of sonic furrow that they kind of carve, because it is in some ways so rooted in, or at least very inspired by, that sort of vibe from the 70s, early 80s, like that immediate post-hippie era where everything suddenly seemed a bit bleak.
Yeah.
And there is that sense of it, and this is something that the theorist Mark Fisher used to write about quite a lot, was the idea that era represented both the death of everything that people of a certain era thought was going to represent the future, but its own way created new visions of the future that were a mixture of dystopian and utopian, and there's always been that uneasy alliance between the two ideas. And whenever I hear there's certain kinds of sounds that when I hear it always brings me mentally to that kind of space, and certainly the Boards of Canada music that I'm familiar with always does that in spades, you know.
Yeah, they absolutely ride that dichotomy.
Yeah, so and I would argue that sort of going veering off from where I was talking about with Shabaka and the Ancestors, about the idea that we're living in the apocalypse and it's whatever comes next is something else. I do feel like there's a way of reading what they're doing with the whole occult way that they go around promotion and everything else, that it's almost like knowing how many cults in the occult have been centered around the idea of apocalypse and apocalypse as renewal rather than an ending point. I do think there's very real ways that you can interpret what they're doing as artists. I mean, I don't think you can separate what they're doing to promote themselves from the art itself, because it's part and parcel of the experience. I do think there's a way of looking at it, is that alone makes it a vital component of the cultural landscape. They're actually using the technological tools that we interface with every day to really comment on ways in which the culture is inseparable from where we are in that. If you like pseudo-apocalyptic, if you want to be hopeful about it, epoch that we're in, you know, I think the two things are absolutely inseparable, and they're definitely riding that wave aesthetically and philosophically. Yep,
absolutely. Good ep.
Good ep.
And I think that just about wraps it up, though, Craig, for yet another episode of fSobrIDMety.
I'm not going to go over that title anytime soon.
Toodle pip.
Toodle pip.
Good ep.
Good ep. Good ep. Those guys know all about bizarre occult electronica and whatnot.
Yep.
All right, so where are we going from here, James? I ask as if I don't know the answer.
We've got a one-way ticket, Craig, to Doom Manor.
We're going from the sublime to the ridiculous.
Yes, we are.
So, regular listeners, we've already trailed it, but we will be returning to Doom Patrol coverage, and this will be the first time we've actually covered a season of Doom Patrol as it's happening. So, not entirely sure 100% how regular our episodes are going to be, but we're going to try and get them as regular as possible and split the season into as many podcast coverage episodes as possible.
Yep, we're going to try and release them as close to the actual episodes as possible. A couple of them are going to be difficult for us, just purely for scheduling wise, but
yeah,
we're going to try and keep up.
Yeah, our first episode on it might be a wee bit late. I'm just looking at our schedule. We might be a wee bit late in getting started, but after we get started, we should be able to keep a momentum.
Mm-hmm. So we'd love you to join us if you're a Doom Patrol fan.
Yep, Doom Patrol. That's on your HBOs, not on your DCs. That's no longer a thing.
You can get it on Stars on Amazon Prime. It also shows on there. So if you're in the UK or other places where you can't get your hands on an HBO Max subscription, that's where to go and check it out. Or alternatively, but yeah, we would hugely appreciate you coming along and listening to us do that. We appreciate you listening to this episode.
We do, we always do, and that thanks also comes from Alan, who, as we said, he can't be with us today.
Tragically unable to join us.
Yeah, no, still not quite sure what happened to Alan, but I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it. But he should be back for the Doom Patrol coverage, so yeah, he'll enjoy that.
Well, it's been fun. I've enjoyed my time immensely here in the HamilTron. Oh shit. She's back. Got to go. Bye. Good ep.
Yep, in the meantime, if you like what you heard today, please do tell a friend, tell several friends, tell some family, spread the word.
Do a like, do a share, do a subscribe.
Yep. Hit us up on our social medias. That I think if the HamilTron is back from her holiday.
James, I'm just getting a notification here. The HamilTron has returned, so she's going to be able to do all the rundown of the social media. She also seems to be quite upset about something. I'm not quite sure what.
Usually is though, so.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what's on, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll pass you over to her, and she can give you the rundown on where to find us online. But in the meantime, once again, thank you for listening. Do join us again. And I think that's about wraps it up. James, how is your drink looking?
My cup of coffee, Craig, is close to the bottom. How's your bottle of wine looking?
Intriguing. My bottle of wine is somewhere around the 50% mark. I have to phrase it another way. That is half the bottle. Toodle pip.
Ah, it's good to be home in my virtual liminal space. I'm going to need another holiday just to get over that rager. I tell you, I'll be walking like John Wayne for a week. Did I leave the door open? Wait, what in the name of sweet fuck has happened here? What the hell is with all the beer cans and crisp packets lying around my workspace? Is that mayonnaise on my console? Who the fuck has been touching my Sean Connery sex shrine? God fucking damn it. Anyway, I suppose before I begin my interrogation of the Three Stooges I should say that fSobrIDEmy, episode 24, Black to the Future Nostalgia, was conceived by Craig Woods and James Hamilton with additional material by Alan Todd, edited by James Hamilton, and is a production of Half the Bottle. The theme music is Colossal Estates, by Errors, available from Rock Action Records. Come join us on our social media pages that we occasionally frequent, on Facebook lol at facebook.com/fSobrIDPodcast, Twitter at fSobrIDcast, Instagram at fSobrID, and search YouTube for fSobrID Podcast. Your queen is a reptile. My queen is Diane Guerrero.
So it's that way that it's very upbeat, but it also has a simultaneously dark groove about it, and it's a real kind of militant rallying, Jesus Christ. Rolos. Give someone your last Rolo.
Alright, time for 20 minutes of Boards of Canada chat. We've got to be consistent in our ratios.
Oh god, I feel so bad every time this happens. Woodsy, rein it in, for fuck's sake.
So before we begin, I've got two statements I'd like to make. The first is, I despise the genre name IDM.
Sorry, I'm not over the title of this segment.
Right.
Sorry, carry on.